Hi, this is David, KD5YDU, and you're watching the Ham Radio 2.0 video podcast, available on live from the hamshack.tv and YouTube.
Good afternoon. Hello. Welcome to Ham Radio 2.0, live from the Ham Shack. I am Jason, KC5HWB. This has been the long-awaited general class. Go back and watch my episode 38, which I put up in two parts. Episode 38, part 1, part 2, and part 3, where you can... I recorded that one was a technician class for anyone who wants to become a ham... I'm getting tongue-tied today. Anyone who wants to become a ham radio operator can watch episode 38, the 3 segments. Each segment is like 2 to 2.5 hours long, and maybe almost 3 in one of them. But it's a class put on by the Hurst Amateur Radio Club, which is a suburb of Fort Worth, Texas, to where an instructor goes through a slideshow presentation and does review questions at the end of each section. So if you've been wanting to go to a class but don't have a class near you, or don't have time to go to the class that is near you, go check out episode 38 on Ham Radio 2.0. Go to livefromthehamshack.tv and scroll down to episode 38. They're all, of course, in chronological order, and you can watch that, and it'll give you all the information you need to pass the technician license exam. So once you are ready to upgrade, after you've passed your technician license exam, check out this. This is going to be episode 66, which is a general class given, again, by the Hurst Amateur Radio Club. This one's going to be done over 3 segments also. There's going to be a part 1, part 2, part 3, and each segment is 2 to 3 hours. So you'll have to set aside some time to go through and watch it and review the questions, and then do some practice tests on your own, which there'll be links to some good practice exams down at the bottom of this blog post as well. And you can come to it and go back to it. The cool thing about having it on video on YouTube is that you don't have to be at a certain location from 6 to 9 for 3 nights in a row or all day on a Saturday. You can watch it at your leisure. So this is the general class that is going to be good through like 2019, I think it is. So you've got quite a bit of time to watch this and upgrade and go get your next class license. So thanks to David, KD5YDU, for the intro to this segment here. Anybody who wants to send me an intro, feel free to do that, and I will put it at the beginning of one of the videos. Just look at the camera. Turn your camera horizontally. Use your camera the way it is, where if you use your phone, turn it horizontally. That's really how it is. And just introduce yourself. Say, hi, my name is such and such, and my call sign's blah, blah, blah. And you're watching the Ham Radio 2.0 video podcast, available on livefromthehamshack.tv and YouTube. So, been wanting to put... I've got 2 or 3 more of those in reserve. You'll be seeing several more viewers upcoming to... You don't have a license yet? You don't have a call sign yet? Do it anyway. Say, I am studying to become a ham radio operator, and you're watching the Ham Radio 2.0 video podcast, available at livefromthehamshack.tv and YouTube. And then I will put you at the front of one of my videos. So 73 guys, hope you enjoy this segment. And hope to see some upgraded technician to general class operator soon. Make a comment on this video at the bottom of the blog post or on YouTube, and let me know that you got your upgrade. 73.
Good morning. And my name is Mike. I want to welcome you to the General Amateur Radio Class license training. This training is provided by the Hurst Amateur Radio Club and Hurst Races. And the facilities are being provided courtesy of Baylor Scott & White, the Grapevine facility. They've asked us to conduct a class here. Unfortunately, none of their people are in the class. Instructors for this class today and the 29th will be Chris, KD5HIY, and me, N5YM. And this is an introduction to general class license. The whole idea is to prepare you for the amateur radio general class license examination, element 3, using the 2015-2019 question pool. Y'all have one of those, right? You're going to need that. Our goal is to help you pass the general exam, and also to help you understand how to effectively use communications with ham radio. Give you some hints on study guides, if you haven't done it already, is that start at the beginning. Use your book. We're going to be you're relying heavily on your book. You're going to be studying. Start at the beginning of each assigned section of the study manual. Read each question. Read all the answers. Then read the explanation for the correct answer, and then highlight that correct answer. And when you get to the end of that section, go back to the beginning and study it again. And each time you study, just study the question and the correct answer. The first time through, you want to know what the incorrect answers are, because some of them look pretty close to the correct answer. But you'll want to recognize those. What you want to understand is you want to understand the correct answer. You're going to need to study your license manual. This class is a supplement to this. It's not a replacement for this. Those of you who may have had some training in the past, I don't know what format that the class in the past that you had in the past used. Some instructors will go through and they'll start with the first question in the book, and we'll read the first question in the book, and we'll read the first answer in the book. And they go to the second one, and the third one, and the fourth one. That's not the way we do it here. That obviously works because people get their license that way. But that's not the way we do it here. We use the book. We figure you've paid for the book. You're smart enough to be able to read the questions and read the answers. We're going to try to fill in all the blanks. We're going to try to make some of this stuff make sense. But there's going to be some stuff you're going to have to memorize. Our goal is to have you memorize what you need to memorize and understand the rest, so that when you read the questions and answers, they make sense for you. You can figure them out. That way, later on in your ham radio career, in your ham radio endeavors, this whole stuff will make sense to you, other than just having read it and memorized it. If you want to memorize all the questions and answers, that's okay, go ahead. That'll still get you your license. I don't have a problem with that. But some of the stuff you're going to need to memorize are frequencies, the formulas, and rules and regulations. There's not, unless you've been in ham radio for about 40 years like me, a lot of the frequencies, formulas, and rules and regulations don't necessarily make sense. I've been in this long enough to kind of have a background and see maybe why they did some of this stuff, and why we have some of the frequency we have, or why some of the rules and regulations are the way they are. But you can go ahead and memorize those. And we'll kind of, as we go through this presentation, we'll kind of talk about what it is you need to memorize. Most everything else, we're going to learn how things work, so you can figure out those correct answers yourself without having to memorize them. Some of this question pool is the same as the technician question pool. Either the two of you, when you took your technician exam, were you offered the general exam? Did you take it? Okay. If you had taken it, you probably would have got at least a third of the questions right. Some people who take it get them all, get enough right to pass the test. But you probably would have at least got 30%, about a third of them right. That's because they're similar. A lot of the information is the same. Same formulas, just different numbers. Sometimes the questions are identical even. So the stuff that you've already learned for your technician, we're not going to relearn that again. We're going to assume you know it. Your technicians, you've been around for a while, we're going to assume you know that. And we're going to cover other things that are unique to the general. Except if some of this stuff that's in the technician leads into some questions that are in the general. Is background for some of the general information. We'll go back and talk about that to begin with. So you're going to see some of the stuff again, formulas and things like that. And up the front, we're going to be talking about some of the same stuff with a little bit different twist for general. We're going to introduce new concepts in a active discussion format. And as we go through here, we're going to do periodic reviews. We're going to learn a little bit, and we're going to do a review. And the review, we're going to do some questions and answers, and those are going to be the same questions and answers that are in the question pool. When you're studying, it's important to take a look at these question pools. There's sub-elements G1 through G0, 10 of them. Commissioner's rules, operating procedures, radio wave propagation, amateur radio practices, electrical principles, circuit components, practical circuit, signals and emission, antennas and feed line, and electrical and RF safety are the 10. Next to that, you'll see how many questions on the exam are extracted from that specific sub-element. So in the sub-element, when you get in your test, you're going to have 5 questions in your test that are selected at random from sub-element G1. And you're going to have 5 that are extracted from sub-element G2 and on down the line. If you'll notice, they're a big part of your exam. 5 questions each are coming out of G1, G2, and G4. So that's a big, so if you want to focus a little extra on something, those are the sub-elements you want to focus a little more extra on. Just like your technician, you're going to need to get 26 of those questions correct to pass the exam. Some hints to help you study. Some of these are kind of corny, but some of them are logical. It hasn't changed. This magic formula, 300 divided by frequency equals wavelength, or 300 divided by wavelength equals frequency in megahertz or wavelength in meters, that formula stays the same. It worked for technician, it still works for general, it's going to work for extra if you take that. So remember, you can rely on that. We'll show you a little later on how you rely on that. Ohm's law, they haven't changed the law. It's still the same. It's not just a good idea, it's the law. We're you may have seen it as E and I and R and P, and way back in one of my earlier classes I had a student in here who says, that's not the way we learned it. We learned it volts, amps, and ohms, because nobody ever asks you, if I've got these many E's and those many ohms, how many V's do I have? You know? So what we've done is we've actually we're going to be teaching it with the actual measurement quantities in there, such as volts, amps, and ohms. So if you're asked a question, it's going to have volts and amps and ohms in the question, or watts and amps and volts in the question. So I would say maybe when you memorize it like that. And it helps because, remember, volts, amps, and ohms, these are in this formula, is based on whole units, whole ohms, whole amps, whole volts. If you started getting into millivolts and microvolts and kilovolts and stuff like that, remember to shift those decimal points around, okay? Another hint is look for exceptions. For example, you can use, most of the bands, you can use 1500 watts of power. So if there's a question on your test about how many watts of power can use on a specific band, the answer is 15, unless it's for 30 and 60 meters. That's the only difference. It might be easier to you to memorize the differences rather than all the ones that are and all the ones that aren't. Most all bands permit voice operation, except 30 meters. If you got a question about on the exam that says, what modes can you use on this band? Well, you can use voice operation on that band unless you're on 30 meters, and that's limited to digital type modes. General bands, when you upgrade to general, you're going to have full privileges on a lot of bands. On most bands, you're going to have full privileges, only limited on 80, 40, 20, and 15 meters. Look for exceptions. Look for things that are same. For example, when you use formulas for resistors and inductors, they behave the same. Resistors and inductors behave the same. Capacitors are the opposite. And here comes all the above. Don't rely on all the above. On your technician exam, all the above was pretty good answer. All the above, most of the answers were correct by all the above. On the general exam, 18 questions are all of the above, 25 questions are not all of the above. Emphasize those that are not. Those are the ones you want to learn. The rest of them are okay. All this making sense so far? These are kind of helpful hints. Look for kind of some way you can help memory aids if you need to learning some of these Q signals. QRS. Well, maybe S for slower. QRQ. Send faster or send quicker. CL, closing down, CL. You might even want to make one up. AR, what can you make up? You say, well, that means I'm finished my message. Okay, all right, I'm done. If that helps. If something like that helps, it might be silly, but if you can remember it, that's great. Use practice exams frequently. If you haven't been in the habit of using the online practice exams, they're great. Use them. It identifies what you're going to take those practice exams online. They're going to be divided up with the same number of questions from each of the sub-elements as a real exam. They're great. They'll help you identify what you know well. If you're going through a practice exam and there's some topics that you're acing, that you're getting right all the time, that's fine. You know it. Don't go study that anymore. Devote your time to something else. Those areas that need improvement. And it shows you when you're making progress. As you go through, as you study, as soon as you begin studying, if you're halfway through the book, take the test. You should get half the questions right. How well you know you're making progress. There's a couple good applications if you haven't already found them. There are a couple online applications, www.aa9pw, that's alpha9papawhiskey.com. Great little thing, downloads a whole test to you. You take the whole test and it grades it. QRZ or QRZ.com/hamtest also has a good online test. They're free. You can use them on your laptop. There's also ones for your iPhone and iPad. N1ZTL is an app that works on iPhone and iPad, and Amateur Radio Exams 1.0 works on Android. Let's talk about licenses. We've talked about this before, but there's a catch for general now. Remember, the Federal Communications Commission, the FCC, they make and they enforce the rules for the amateur radio service in the U.S. and possessions, and that's critical to remember. U.S. and possessions. They don't make the rules for foreign countries. They make the rules for the U.S. and its possessions. And amateur radio licenses are issued by the Federal Communications Commission. The FCC issues the licenses as well. So they make the rules, they make the regulations, they issue the licenses. However, they don't give exams. Now, if you've seen when you took your technician, you've got a bunch of volunteers. You've got people called volunteer examiners who work for a volunteer examination coordinator called a VEC. They're a liaison between the volunteer examiners and the FCC. Remember, right, you had a group of people, a bunch of local hams that sat down and helped you get your license, give you the exam, sent it off to a VEC. The VEC put it in the database for the FCC, and they issued a license to you. So you don't. Yeah, remember, the FCC doesn't give exams. They issue a license, they make the rules and regulations. They don't give the exams. And a volunteer examiner is an amateur that's accredited by one or more VECs to administer license exams. You must be 18 years old. Even if you're not a resident, if you're a legal alien, if you've got a U.S. FCC-issued license, you can be accredited as an examiner. Why is this important to you? Because now when you get your technician license, you can be a VE2. Now you can help. You can help, you can sit down in exam sessions, and you can help make new hams. The only catch is that as a general, you're limited to conducting technician class licenses only. You can't give general exams, you can't give extra exams. So this is important to you, and I encourage you to go ahead and get involved with a volunteer examiner. There'll be a lead VE in most areas. Get involved, sign up, come in and help take exams, help give exams. The same for the ThingWorks that you saw on your technician license. It's the same way for the general class license. You're going to get an examination book. It's going to have 35 questions. They are still going to be word for word the same as the question pool. There's going to be an answer sheet where you darken in the dots. You still do that the same. There's 35 questions, even though there's 100 spots to put it, or 50 spots to put it on the sheet. You still need 26 out of 35 questions to pass. And you get a CSCE, and a CSCE is still valid for 365 days. Now, when you got your CSCE, you had something, when you're a technician, you had something to walk home with and say, I did it. I got proof here that I'm a ham. I got proof now that I passed the exam, but I can't operate yet because my name's still not in the ULS database, and I don't know what my call sign is. So you had to wait for your name to show up in the ULS database. Well, guess what with general? Your name is already in the ULS database. When you sign your name to that CSCE, at that instant, you are a general. And you can start operating as a general. You can walk outside. If you've got an HF mobile rig in your car, you can walk out and start talking on that HF mobile rig. There's one catch, though. You're not in the ULS database yet. You're authorized, but you're not in the ULS database. A little later, we'll talk about official observers, people who monitor the band for violations and things like that. Well, there are going to be people out there, and the first guy you talk to, he's going to say, hello, how you doing? And he go, wait a minute, I just looked you up in the log, and you ain't supposed to be here. You're a tech, and you're in a general class part of the band. Well, you're required to warn them about that. You're required to identify that. Anytime that you operate in anything that's not in a technician class license, you have to append a designator, a call sign, a designator to the back of your call sign. In this case, it's /AG. What's your call sign, Beth?
KG5 KBO.
What would you say if you were a general?
KG5 KBO/AG.
Right, absolutely, right. That way, until you get your name shows up in the call sign database, you don't need, you're going to need to use that. But you don't need to do that if you're operating within your technician license. Does that make sense? Okay. Now, we talk about that. Did the FCC, Mark, did the FCC send you a license?
When I passed my technician exam, that was in 1972.
Okay, you got a license in the mail. Did you get a license in the mail, Beth? Okay, so Beth already knows about this. About a year and a half ago, the FCC decided they'd save money. And they stopped mailing those licenses out. Now to get a copy of your license, you have to go online to the URLS database and download one and print it. That's going to be important in the future. If you want a copy of your existing license, you got to go to the FCC database and download a copy and print it. So those are the instructions on how to do that, how to go in and download your license. And you can print a copy of it. You could either download an official copy or a reference copy. You want to get you at least an official copy to carry with you. Something else has been changed also in just recently. As you know, the term of your license is 10 years. You also have a 2-year grace period on the end. In that 10-year period, you can operate without a problem at all. In that 2-year period, your license is still there. It's kind of in suspension. It's still there, but you can't operate in that 2-year grace period. But anytime during that 2-year grace period, you can renew and you're okay. What happened if you went outside that 2-year grace period? After 12 years, you went outside the 2-year grace period, what happened to your license? If you had a general, you had to start over. You had to take the technician. You had to take the general over. You had to take the extra over. If you was extra, you had to take all those tests over again. Your license was dead. That's it. The FCC had a change of heart. And now they say for general, advanced, and amateur extra, if you're outside of that 2-year period, if you're outside of 12 years, your license isn't dead. Your privileges aren't dead. You can restart it by only taking the technician's license. If you take the tech, you can restart the whole thing. So you don't have to take them all over again. That's a relief to a lot of people who have not used their license for a long time. They think, I better start using it again. I worked real hard to get to my extra. They look on there and they say, oh, it expired 3.5 years ago. I've got to do it all over again. Well, now you get credit for your old license by taking the technician over again, whatever that old license was. And the reason I say that is on your license, when does your license currently expire? Do you know?
2026.
2026. Okay, your license expires probably 2025, okay. Even though you've had a license, renewed your license recently, when you take your general exam, you're only upgrading. The clock doesn't start over. So let's say, for example, I'm 8 years into my term, and I upgrade, I'm still 8 years into my term. It doesn't start the clock over again. I just upgraded my license. So remember, don't be surprised when you print your new license, it still has the original expiration date on it. So keep an eye on that. When you upgrade your license, you can operate anywhere in the FCC has jurisdiction. FCC has jurisdiction with your license in the continental U.S., Alaska, Hawaii, Guam, Puerto Rico, the Virgin Islands. That is in ITU Region 2. If you remember back from your technician exam, we live in International Telecommunications Union Region 2. So if you ever run across a question on any FCC licensed ham radio test that says anything about ITU regions, it's always Region 2 because we're talking about the FCC, and that's where it has jurisdiction, and that's where your licenses are good at. You can operate in other countries as well. There are other countries who have reciprocal operating agreements that says if you've got a general license, you can go to England and you can operate in England within their similar license class. You can operate in frequencies over there without having to get a license there. if you don't want to. Sometimes you have to let them know, sometimes you don't, you just go in the country and do it. However, whatever country you're in, if you go to Italy and you operate in Italy and you know how to talk Italian, that's all fine and good, but remember you're a U.S. ham. When you identify, you must identify in English. If you're talking to, even if you're at home and you're talking to someone on the radio and you want to practice your German on someone, so you talk to German stations, remember you have to identify in English. You can communicate in any language you want, but you have to identify in English because you have a U.S. FCC license. Remember, we're in ITU Region 2. What do we need to remember about operating? Well, operating considerations that we have to think about are we always have to comply with FCC rules Part 97. Part 97 of the FCC rules are the ones that govern the U.S. amateur radio service. FCC has a whole lot of rules and regulations. We fall in Part 97. That's our piece. And you need to operate in conformance to good engineering and amateur radio practices. Now, who decides what's good engineering and amateur radio practices? If the FCC rules don't tell you specifically what to do, who determines what you should do for good amateur and engineering and amateur practices? Well, the FCC will make that determination. They may not tell you up front, but they'll help you decide what it is. Remember, with the FCC rules, you're always going to comply with the rules. Because anytime you might think, well, what if this is a situation occurs? Or what if that situation occurs? If you look at the FCC rules and regulations in Part 97, they got it covered. Good engineering practices and rules and practices also have to do with what band allowances and things like that. Also, anytime you want to operate, you need to make sure you minimize interference as much as possible. Don't intentionally to talk over the top of another station. Don't operate too close to another station. You're going into a whole new world when you go into HF, where rather than being on a handy talkie or a portable radio in which you have stuff memorized in channels and you jump from one channel to another, how you're going to have a variable tuning that you can tune all the way across the band, any frequency you want. Make sure you stay far enough away from other people that are on other operators that you don't bleed over and interfere with them. And remember, nobody owns a frequency. Nobody. If they use it every day, that's all fine and good. If there's a net on, respect the net. That's good amateur radio practices, but that net doesn't own that frequency. Good amateur practice, for example, is band plans. The bands are divided up by mission or type, or mode. There's also things called DX windows. There's areas in the frequency bands here that are set aside for international communications. The FCC doesn't say it has to be that way, but the hams have all agreed to do that, and that's good practice. And the FCC, those things that hams have decided are good practice, the FCC might enforce those or respect those. Remember, there's nobody owns a frequency. Even though you've got a repeater, you don't own that frequency. You use that frequency if you've got a repeater. And repeaters comes in two types. Coordinated repeaters, those in which everybody's agreed that you're going to use that frequency. And the repeaters are located or coordinated so that you don't intentionally or intentionally too close to another repeater on the same frequency that you interfere. Those are coordinated and uncoordinated. Non-coordinated repeaters are somebody who decides to put one up and they don't care whether there's another repeater there or not. They don't seek any agreement. They can legally do that because nobody owns a frequency. However, in case a non-coordinated repeater and a coordinated repeater interfere with one another, the FCC does say that the coordinated repeater has jurisdiction over that non-coordinated repeater on that frequency, although they still don't own it. Example of division by mission on the 20 meter band, 14.07 to 14.1 is universally agreed that they're going to set that aside for digital use. So if you're operating a digital mode, that's the area that you're going to be operating in. In repeaters, as we said, in case of interference, non-coordinated repeaters much fix the problem. Questions at this point? I think we're ready for a review. Question off the test. When must you add the specific special identifier AG after your call sign if you're a technician class license and have a CSCE for general class operator privileges, but the FCC has not yet posted your upgrade on its website? Which one of those questions do you think are correct? Whenever you use a general class frequency, whenever you use any frequency, when you use a technician frequency, or it's not required. Whenever you operate using general class frequencies. Because what's in the database says you're a technician to anybody that wants to look it up. As long as you're operating as a technician, you don't need to tell anybody otherwise. However, if you are showing up in a database as a technician and you're operating on general class frequencies, it's good to inform everyone else that's there that you are actually legal, that you have a CSCE. Who credits volunteer examiners are credited by what organization? Who accredits volunteer examiner coordinator? Volunteer examiners. I'll get that out eventually. The FCC, the ULS, volunteer examiner coordinator, or the Wireless Telecommunications Bureau? Who accredits volunteer examiners?
C.
Volunteer examiner coordinator. That kind of makes sense, doesn't it? The ones that coordinate the volunteer examiners. Yeah. How long is the CSCE valid for? 365 days a year. What ITU region is operation in the 7.175 to 7.3 megahertz band permitted for a control operator holding a FCC issued general class license? That's a lot of words. What do we say about ITU? What do we say the answer is on this test?
B.
Region 2. It'd been a lot easier to answer that question of what ITU region do we operate in, but when you see a question like that, remember that's why the hint is it's always ITU region 2. Who or what determines good engineering and good amateur practice as applied to the operation of an amateur station in all respects not covered by FCC Part 97 rules? If the FCC doesn't specifically say what you can and can't do, who will make the judgment anyhow? The FCC, correct. Which of the following is true concerning access to frequencies? Nets have priority. QSOs, or conversations in process, always have priority. Y'all know QSO means conversation? One of those Q signals? No one has priority access to a frequency. It's common courtesy should be a guide. Our contest operations must always yield to non-contest use of frequencies. It's back to who owns the frequency, right? And the answer to that question is?
C.
No one owns a frequency.
But the common courtesy thing makes me nervous. It's like, if they just said no one has priority, I'd say, okay, C, but common courtesy,
Well, let's say you're on I'll give you an example. There's a guy talking on the radio, and you decide you want to talk right there too. It's true, he doesn't own that frequency, but common courtesy says you don't want to try to chase him off. That make sense?
yeah.
Yeah. Most of the regulations, most of the agreements that hams have, a lot of those agreements are based on courteous operation to other ham radio operators. The FCC, the ARRL has a amateur's guide that says an amateur radio operator is. These are the qualities of a good amateur radio operator, and one of them is courteous. Sometimes going to ARRL. I mean, that's not a binding document, but it's a good thing that everybody ought to look at every once in a while. Discussion? We're going to talk about a lot of stuff. You're going to be a general. And one of the things that I encourage you to do is get one of those. If you don't have one, get a copy of the Radio Amateur Handbook from ARRL. New, these run, let's see, when I bought this one in 2007, it was about $45, and they still run $45 to $50. You don't need to buy a new one. Look on Amazon or look on eBay or someplace like that and buy a used one. This 2007, I have a 2015 version as well. The information is almost identical. The only thing that's changed is maybe some construction projects and things like that. the rules, the regulations, procedures, all that sort of stuff is the same. You're getting to the point now where everything you need to know about ham radio is in one of these. You can typically buy them from $18 to $20 used. I would say don't buy one that's more than maybe 15 or 16 years old. 2000 or later will cover just pretty much everything that you need. But I would definitely suggest that you purchase a Radio Amateur's Handbook. Take a look at that. How are we doing so far? Anybody need a break? Or you want to go on? What do you think? Keep rolling? Okay. We'll keep rolling. Radio frequencies. You have one. You have one. You have both. Okay, you both have them. Did I give those to you already? Okay. See, I'm getting forgetful. All right. If you'll look on this chart right here, right there, that'll show you all the bands that you can operate on. Also show you all the bands that a technician can operate on and an extra can operate on. And there's also an A in there for advanced, and there is also an N in there for novice. Those are two old licenses that the FCC used to issue. They had slightly different privileges. Anyone who currently has a novice license can continue to renew it and continue to use the same privileges. Anyone who has an advanced class license can continue to renew that license and still has advanced class privileges. A while back, the FCC simplified this 5 licenses and reduced them to 3. FCC doesn't issue new technician license, and we don't examine for technician license. And the FCC doesn't issue new advanced license. We don't examine those. But those people who have those won't get them taken away. So the things that you want to look on here on this band chart is anything that has the letter G after it. That's where you get to operate now as a general. Once you pass the test on the 29th, this is where you get to operate. And the modes you get to operate in. And you get a lot more real estate now with general. A lot more than you have with technician. But remember, you don't lose anything. This is an upgrade. What you had as technician, you get to keep. You get more now. Let's talk about review frequencies. There are 3 basic frequency groups. High frequency, which we call HF. And I'll refer to it as HF bands through here. Those are what we typically call the short wave bands. And we'll talk a little more about short wave bands when we get into wavelength. Okay? The very high frequency band, those are VHF. They go from 30 to 300 megahertz, where the HF went from 3 to 30 megahertz. And the ultra high frequency bands, the UHF bands, from 300 to 3,000 megahertz, or 3 gigahertz. Remember, the general class gains privileges and gets to keep the VHF and UHF. As a technician, you primarily had most of your privileges in VHF and UHF, although you did have some limited privileges, and you do still have limited privileges on HF. You've got voice and CW on 10 meters, and you have some HF, I think 80 and 40 meters, you have some CW privileges as well, if any of you have used code on those bands. But you had some HF privileges, but you get a lot more now. Remember that common relationship between wavelength and frequency. Remember wavelength. That's how far a radio wave travels in a complete cycle, how at the distance it travels in meters. In a complete cycle at the speed of light. At 300 million meters per second. That's where that 300 came from. If you divide that 300 by frequency, you get wavelength. Frequency is going to be in megahertz, million hertz. 300 was 300 million miles per second, and the wavelength is going to be in meters. Now, of course, when you do your math, you can knock off all those extra zeros and just take 300 divided by frequency equals wavelength. Or if you already know the wavelength, you can take 300 divided by wavelength to get frequency in megahertz. When it comes to the bandwidth, the frequency, the bands are usually rounded off to the nearest meter. As you'll notice, we talk about 80 meters, 75 meters, 40, 30, 60, 15, 20, 12. If you do the math, you'll find out that you might come up with a decimal point there. One of the reasons we do meters is that goes back to old amateur radio practices, actually old radio practices, in which way back in Marconi's day, we didn't refer to a radio wave by its frequency. They referred to a radio wave by its length. And if they want to shift frequencies, they wouldn't say go up or down a few megahertz. They'd say go up or down a meter or two, or half a meter. And this is an old legacy thing. So the bands were kind of divided up into meters, and at one time, 40 meters fell pretty much exactly in 40. So we still refer to that. It's still universal. And up to the early 50s, a lot of the European shortwave radios still had meters. Instead of the band didn't have feature frequency, it featured meters on the band. So we're still talking about meters. So it's an older term, but we still identify these groups of frequencies by meters. It's easier than saying 14.25 megahertz band, say 40 meters. So, but you can, so if you want on your exam, if there's a question in there and you have 4 choices and none of them are close, you know, they all are diverse frequencies from one another, rather than if you didn't have to memorize what meter band that was in, you can always do the math real quick, divide it into 300 to get meters, or divide meters into 300 to get frequency. But that still applies. It applied on your technician, it still applies here. Let's talk about the bands we use. This is what the general class band is going to look like for you. You get the entire 10 meter band, okay? And you get to use full legal limit, which is 1500 watts peak envelope power. The bottom part of the band, from 28 megahertz to 28.3 megahertz, is reserved for digital and Morse code. The upper part of the band is devoted for voice communications. From 28.3 to 29.5 is conventional voice, which is upper sideband AM, and AM is a sideband is an AM signal, upper sideband signal. 28.5 to 29.5 to 29.7 is FM. That's the only place in the high frequency bands, in the high frequency spectrum, that you can use FM is in the 10 meter band. And it's all the way up at the top. Now remember, you're saying, oh gosh, I'm a technician. Can I talk up there? Nope. Your technician privilege is cut off about right here. So as a technician, you can't go on that band and operate in the FM. You can section. You can as a general. Well, that's where the repeaters are located. There are 10 meter repeaters. But there's a kicker here. There are 10 meter repeaters that have an input. There are cross-band repeaters that listen on one band and transmit on the other. There are some repeaters out there that are cross-band repeaters that listen on 2 meters and outputs on 10 meters. Up there in that FM portion where techs can't use. Remember, you can listen to anything place you want to listen to, right, as a technician? You're not limited. You're only limited to the frequencies you transmit on. Can you as a technician use a repeater that legally you can transmit on in 2 meters that has an output on 10 meters? The answer to that question is yes, you can. How can you do that? Well, because that repeater has a control operator. You're not the control operator on that repeater, hopefully. That repeater has a control operator, and if that control operator has a general class license or better, you can operate on their repeater. So you can, that's just a way that you can actually work that part of the band up there as a technician, using a crossband repeater. The kicker is the repeater control operator. Now you can't own a repeater, you can't be a control operator on a repeater as a technician that's up there. Only someone with a general class license or higher can. But as a technician, you can get into that part of the frequency band. They didn't tell you that when they told you to give you your tech class, did they? Most people don't even think about that. The next band we use is we're going down. We're going down in frequency, up in meters. Because remember, the slower the frequency, the longer the wavelength. Is the 12 meter band. You get the entire 12 meter band Again, you get full legal limit, 1500 watts peak envelope power. That band is broken up into from 24.89 to 24.93. That portion of the band is reserved for Morse code, digital, CW. The upper part of it is used for phone. And again, we use upper sideband. If we're going to use sideband, we use upper sideband on that. It's a 24.9. These are the things you're going to need to memorize. And they're on your band chart there. Here comes the 15-meter band. As a general, you don't get the entire band. You only get pieces of the band. The CW portion goes from 2100. Can you see that laser pointer? Okay. It goes from 2100 or 21 megahertz to 21.2 megahertz. That's the CW portion of the band, CW and digital. However, you can't operate in that lower part of the band, 21 to 21.025. You can only operate in the upper part of that CW section. Same thing in the voice section, 21.2 to 21.45. You can only operate in the 21.275 to 21.45. Again, if you're operating on sideband, it's upper sideband only. That's conventional. That's the convention. FCC didn't say you had to do that. Hams decided amongst themselves, and that's the way they operate. That's good operating practice. What do you notice about this? This band, what do you notice about where your privileges are?
It's always at the higher end.
Right, it's always in the upper end of that segment. When there's a segment, you got the upper end of it. Here's a 20-meter band, 1400 to 14.35. That band's pretty good band day and night for communications. 20 meters is a really popular band. You can operate on, when we get into propagation, we'll talk more about propagation, but 20-meter band's a good band, good universal band. You don't use all that. You can still use 1500 watts. You still get full legal limit on that, but you don't get the entire band. The lower part of the CW band, you don't get. The lower part of the voice band, you don't get. Again, single sideband uses upper sideband if you're topping on 20 meters. The upper sideband we use. Actually, this is pretty much the cutoff point. 14 megahertz and above, the answer is always upper sideband. So any frequency higher than 14, the answer is always going to be upper sideband. There's a couple exceptions, but that's a universal. There's everything above that. So you'll learn the exceptions if you want. In the middle of this, there's a section called data. And that is universally agreed from 14.07 to 14.10 to use data mode, keyboard-to-keyboard communications and all sorts of other things, data modes of communications. We'll talk a little bit more about digital communications, that's what that is. We'll talk about a little bit more about digital communications later on. But that's the area that's set up for data. Okay so far? 30-meter band. You get the whole thing. 30-meter band is this band that's only, no voice. It's the only band that you can't use voice on. 30 meters. Only CW and data. It goes from 10.10 megahertz to 10.15 megahertz. Not a very big band. So you're limited to really narrow bandwidth communications, which is CW and data. You get the entire band. You don't get, this is the unique band. Remember, this is unique. You don't get full power. You don't get 1500 watts. You only get 200 watts PEP on this. You don't get but you get the entire band, but you don't get voice either. No phone, no image. And we are a secondary user on the 30-meter band. That means that there's other users out there who are allocated this frequency as primary users. Read that, government and military. But as long as you don't interfere with any of their communications, you can use this band, all this band at will. What do you do if you find out that you do interfere with their communications?
Get off
Change the frequency. Move off to another frequency. Don't get head up and lock and say, well, nobody owns this. Well, maybe they do. In the amateur practice, nobody owns it. When the government's concerned, they own it all. Make sense on this? Kind of a unique band. Yep. The 40-meter band. Another very popular band. 40-meter band goes from 7 to 7.3 megahertz. You get full power on it, 1,500 watts again. You get to run a linear amplifier if you want, as long as you don't go over 1,500 watts peak envelope power. But you don't have full privileges in this band. You only have partial privileges. What do we notice about this band that looks just like the other bands? What we notice about this band is that there's two segments. The CW segment is on the bottom part of the band. The phone segment is on the top part of the band. And what do we know about the general part of that? Same thing as we said before. We get the upper portion, the higher frequency part of each one of those. We're restricted out of the lower frequency portion of that. So on 700 to 7.025 we can't operate as generals, and 7.125 to 7.175 we can't operate as generals. Who do you think can operate here? Extras. That's why if you want that piece of real estate in there, you need to upgrade to extra. What do we also know about this band? This one's different. Single sideband uses lower sideband now. Remember, it's below 1,400 megahertz. Convention says we use lower sideband. We're going to hit an exception pretty quick, so don't.
It's the other end of the frequency, but it's lower by.
Yes. Lord, if you have a modern radio, and the one I have over there, the FT817 is a modern radio. This is one made in the last 10 or 15 years. Typically the default is that when it goes and selects those frequencies, it'll select that side. When you go put and say I want to do single sideband, it'll select upper or lower sideband automatically based on frequency. But you can change it. You can go in the menu or you can use a button. You can change the sideband from upper to lower if you want to do that for some reason. You may be operating a digital mode or something like that that you want to switch the sidebands on. But it usually does that for you. But you need to remember this anyhow because you're going to be asked about this. You need to know whether this is how you, even though your radio might do it for you by default, you might get in there and play with the menus and get it changed. Well, you need to know where you're supposed to be and how you're supposed to operate. This is our sideband. Okay? 160 meter band. You get it all. And it's all voice and phone. You get the entire 60 meter band and you get full power on it. 160 meter band is a nice band. It's prone to a lot of man-made noise. It's not necessarily as popular a band as it might be, only because when you think about antennas and your antenna size is based on the frequency, and you decide you want to put a half-wave antenna up on a dipole on 160 meters, well, that antenna is going to be 80 meters long, and 80 meters is about how many feet? About 250 feet. Most people don't have enough room to string a 250 foot antenna. And then you should place your antenna quarter wavelength off the ground. Put another 150 feet off the ground. It's not necessarily, it's a nice band. Actually, it is prone to atmospheric noise. But there are people who love it. But you won't get a lot of interfering stations on that. You've got a lot of real estate to operate on that, and very few people on there. We've got an odd band. This is a 60 meter band. This is a band that's channelized. On this band, most of the new radios allow you to save memories, just like to HF frequencies, save frequencies and things, just like you do on, you're used to doing on 2 meters and 70 centimeters on FM. You can save channels. Most of your radios allow you to save channels. This is one of the areas you want to put the save channels because this is broken up into 5 channels. And there's a lot of restrictions on this. Okay? And first of all, we're a secondary user. There's other people who are allowed to use this band that have priority over us. You have a narrow bandwidth, 2.8 kilohertz in width. You can use all 5 of those channels, or any 5 of those channels. However, you're limited to 100 watts effective radiated power as measured on a dipole antenna. If you have you're using an antenna that has more gain, more gain than a dipole, then you have to reduce your power so it's equal to a dipole. And you have to log, in your log, any antenna that you're using is not a dipole. I don't particularly use this band. Nothing wrong with it. I don't particularly use this band. I've got a lot of other bands that operate on that have a lot less restrictions, so I don't have to worry about this. Some of the newest new radios. Mine doesn't. That one over there, that 817, doesn't. But the upgrade model of the D model has those already stored in the radio. Most real new radios, most new radios that are say 5 or 6 or 8 years old, will have those stored in there already for you. You got to be real careful that you don't get off frequency. You have to be, because you don't want to transmit. You don't want to get out in that little gap between those bands there, between those channels. That's probably where you're going to find, if you listen, that's probably where you're going to find the other users at, the primary users. So you don't want to get out there. You don't want to get too wide. You don't want to get too much power. And you want to make sure you log this as dipole. But it's a perfectly usable band. You got it. And if you want the challenge, go for it. Do I have anything you want to talk about? Okay. This one, you can use this one uses upper sideband, although the frequency is not above 14. This is an exception. This is that odd band. The odd band about this is that we use upper sideband or CW. You can also use narrow bandwidth data such as PSK31 or PACTOR3 in this as well. And we'll talk about PSK and stuff in a little bit too. Okay, this confusing enough? But if the question in the test is, what band do you limit to channels? You're limited to channels on the 60 meter band. Here's the other thing. What's the band? Wrong button. There's a test question right there. How wide is it? 2.8 kilohertz. That's in your question pool if you haven't come to it already. We talked about secondary frequencies. Some ham bands are available on a secondary basis. There are HF frequencies and there are UHF, VHF frequencies that are on a secondary basis. Hams can use those frequencies as long as they don't interfere with the primary user. If they're interference, you've got to stop transmitting and fix the cause of the interference. The cause of the interference may be the fact that you're on the same frequency they are, in which case that's easy. It's an easy fix. You move. It could be that you've got your radio is transmitting too wide of a signal, and you're bleeding over into their frequency. There are other things that cause overmodulation, for example, will cause you to bleed over. You can fix that as well. Secondary user, what are the two bands that were a secondary user? 30 and 60. What do we see about the general class bands? In the case that you're not permitted to use the entire band, voice privileges are usually on the upper portion of the band. Single sideband is the most commonly used voice mode on the HF bands because it doesn't take up a lot of spectrum. It doesn't use a lot of frequency, a lot of bandwidth. Upper sideband is used on all frequencies, 20 meters, which is 1400 megahertz and above, all the way up to VHF and UHF. That's above 14 megahertz. VHF and UHF. As a technician, if you want to use single sideband, you'll be using VHF and UHF bands, and you'll be using upper sideband. 30 meters is the only band that does not allow voice or image operation. Questions so far? Are you ready for a review?
What was the last point there?
Remember, it's voice only. If it's not voice, not phone, as we call it, you don't use it on, you can't use it on, 30 meters you can't use voice or phone on. You ready to try some practice questions? Which of the following frequencies is within the general class portion of the 75 meter band? This would be one that you want to memorize and know what that band looks like. First of all, what frequencies are in the 75 meter band?
It's somewhere around 4 megahertz.
Okay, so you can, yeah, somewhere
Well,
around 4
that's three of
megahertz.
them are all
Yeah.
eligible.
Well, the first one's not.
Yeah, first one we can throw
Yeah,
out.
okay. And now you look at your band chart and see whether you can operate on 400 or 4 megahertz or 400 kilohertz, 4,000 kilohertz on the 40 meter band. You're not going to be able to use this on the test, but you can do it. Looks like it's outside the band, doesn't it?
Let's see, first of all, yeah, we don't have 75 meters on
Nope, you have 80 meters, which is essentially the same band.
this, okay?
So-
So look, it cuts off right at 4.000.
Yeah.
So we throw away D then also.
Mm-hmm.
But now we've got B and C.
Mm-hmm. 3750 is 3790.
Okay, so it's obviously within 3,900. Because we go down to 3.8,
Mm-hmm.
so that throws out B then.
Those out B. Mm-hmm. And in this case, yeah.
You're telling me I need to memorize this. All right, I can probably remember 4 megahertz, 4.000 megahertz. So I would throw out A and D, I would think, without having to think too hard. Now it gets kind of touch and go. What do I need to memorize? I guess.
Memorize the answer. Highlight this as the yellow answer and memorize that one. Highlight that in your book and memorize that one. There won't be too many of those that are that close. That's the good. As you go through your book, you're not going to find too many of them that are that close. That's one reason I chose this question, because it's close.
So just
And
keep
that's
in
the
mind
correct
that
answer.
The lower you go in frequency, the longer the wavelength. So that says 75 meters.
Mhm.
This says 80 meters. So 75 meters is a little bit shorter, so it's going to be a higher frequency than 80, which is a little bit lower.
Yeah,
Getting out my grades and
yeah. That narrows it down a little bit as long as you know that that's out of the band. When you operate as a general class license operator, I've had a ham radio license for well over 40 years now, and I have copies of these pasted all over the place because I never, ever memorize this stuff. Never memorize anything I can look up. Unfortunately, with the test you're going to take, you're going to have to memorize a little bit. This is some of that stuff at the front end you have to memorize a little bit. That's one of the reasons I use this review question, is this is the one of them you're going to need to memorize. When may a 10-meter repeater retransmit the 2-meter signal from a station having a technician class control operator? When the guy operating the 2-meter radio is on, that's operating a 2-meter radio is a technician. When can a 10-meter repeater retransmit that? Under no circumstances. Only if the station on 10 meters is operating under special temporary authorization allowing such a retransmission. Only during an FCC declared general state of communications emergency, only during an FCC, or only if the 10-meter repeater control operator holds a general class license. There you go. If the guy that's running that repeater is a general, it's okay. Now look at some of these other ones that are close. Isn't it true that in a real emergency, you can use any means of communications necessary? But that's not what it says. That says only if it's an emergency. That's not correct. I'm not sure there's any such thing as this. And we know under no circumstances, we've already talked about that, we know we have the option. So D is the answer. Yeah. That's why I dwelt on that in such depth, because it's a question on a test. Whoops, I'm going the wrong way, aren't I? Did I? Yeah. Yeah, we are, did that, yeah. What's the maximum transmitting power an amateur radio station may use on 10.14 megahertz? What band is that? What meter band is that? Quick, do the math.
30.
30. 300 divided by 10, 30. What do we know about 30 meters?
It's real sticky.
What do we know about the power on 30 meters?
So it's
We know that 1500 watts is the watts you can use on all bands except a few of them. You can't use 2,000 watts. Okay, so what about 1,000 watts? We ever talked about that? Or what about 200 watts? What do you think about the 30 meter band? What do you remember about the 30 meter band? The limitations that General has in the 30 meter bands. Two major limitations. What are they? What about, can you operate voice on it? Nope. Can you operate full power on it? How much power can you operate?
like it's 200.
Just a little bit. Yeah. 200. That's that odd one with regards to the rest of the privileges you have. That's the odd one. What's the maximum permitted bandwidth that the FCC will allow you to operate on the 60 meter band? That's that channelized band, remember? What's the maximum bandwidth that you can use?
That's the width of the entire band, isn't it?
No, no, each one of those channels,
All those channels.
when you're transmitting, an upper sideband, how wide of a signal can you have? That's one of those restrictions on the 60 meter band. If you remember right, that's 2.8 kilohertz. It's not super narrow, but it's not real wide. 2.8 kilohertz is about the width of a single sideband signal. It's not overmodulated. What mode of communications is the most commonly used mode on the HF bands, the high frequency bands? FM, double sideband, single sideband, or phase modulation? Single sideband. FM's wide, double sideband is not quite as wide, but it's still wide. Single sideband is less than half the double sideband, and phase modulation, that's not even something we want to talk about. The correct answer is C. Which sideband, if you're going to use sideband, which sideband is the most commonly used for voice communications on frequencies of 1400 megahertz, 20 meters, or higher? It's the upper, of all the stuff we have in the HF band, it's the upper part of the frequency, and that's exactly what it is, the upper sideband. So whether it's 20 meters, 15 meters, 12 meters, 10 meters, 6 meters, 2 meters, whatever, it's all upper sideband. What about the most commonly used voice communications in VHF and UHF band? When you're using single sideband on VHF and UHF, what's the most common sideband used on that? Is it above 14 megahertz? Is VHF above 14 megahertz? Remember, everything above 14 megahertz and above is upper sideband. And VHF is above HF. So if you're on 2 meters or 70 centimeters or 220, and you're using sideband, you'll be using upper sideband because it's higher in frequency than 1400 megahertz, which was on the previous question. Remember the previous one? We said 14 megahertz or higher, upper sideband. Well, 144 is higher, right?
So it's really the same question.
Upper sideband, yeah. Sometimes you kind of stumbled on that a little bit, didn't you? Well, this is one of the reasons we put these on here.
It was lower sideband.
Yeah, this is one of them we put it on. You was looking for it because you're already, but see, you probably won't see those two questions together on the test. so they won't confuse you. But this is one of the reasons I when I picked these questions, I only pick a few questions because we don't go through all the questions in the question pool here. But I try to pick those that you most likely would have issues with, or you most likely would have questions about, or something you maybe to help reinforce it and make it stick a little better. What segment of the 20-meter band is most often used for data transmissions? Remember, CW and data is down, first of all, is down in that bottom part of the band. And we talked about it in 2 instances, and I pointed it out.
I'm gonna go with B. I've seen-
14.07 to 14.1?
I've seen YouTube videos where they're doing PSK 31.
Exactly.
And it's always set for 1407.
1407, correct. That is correct. That is correct. And I was going to say, think about PSK 31, 14.07 is the magic frequency for PSK 31 on 20 meters. All right. Some general operating procedures. Probably you have not used a log as VHF operators because you don't have to. The FCC eliminated the mandatory use of logs many years ago. It used to be something that the FCC required you to log every transmission that you made, every contact you made. And they've removed, there were some exceptions. If you were mobile, you didn't have to do that. They eventually eliminated that. A log, though, is still something that's very useful, is to keep a station log and what you do. There are several reasons to do that. 3 reasons are legal. Your log is a legal log of a transmission will be invaluable, especially in providing your innocence in an interference complaint. If you knew when you were operating and what frequency you were operating on, sometimes when you put a ham radio operator on top of your house or in your backyard or up on a tower or up on a pole, if you can do that, and you don't have a homeowners association restriction from doing that, but if you put a radio up, or even if you don't, and your neighbors find out that you have a ham radio, that's what's wrong with my washing machine. My washer malfunctions, it's that ham radio guy, it's that radio stuff. Or that's why my cell phone doesn't work well here. Or whatever it is. And they start complaining about that. And they come to you and say, you're interfering with my washing machine. And you say, it's ridiculous. They don't hit you. They don't strike you on the spot. They just stop back in the house and they call the local police and say, this person's messing with my washing machine, or my cell phone, or my radio, or my television, or whatever. Well, first of all, the local law enforcement folks don't have any authority over what you're doing, because the FCC has authority over you. But they don't know that to begin with. If they get a complaint, they're going to come to your house. That's their job, is to come to your house and investigate it. If nothing else, if they do know it, they're going to come to your house and say, the neighbors are complaining, but I know it's not really you, but I'm here anyhow just for the record. But they don't know any different. So they may come to your house and you may respectfully tell them that, yes, that's fine and good, and I don't believe I'm interfering with you. And by the way, respectfully, this is not a local civil matter. I'm governed and licensed by the Federal Communications Commission, and a complaint of such should go to the Federal Communications Commission. So they go back to the homeowner and they say, you got to call the FCC. They call the FCC. So now the FCC examiner, you get a knock on the door. Remember back in your technician license that if the FCC wants to come visit you and see your station, you got to let them in? Okay. They knock on their door and say, I got a complaint from down here. Okay. So they come in, they sit down, and look at your radio equipment and say, oh, well, you don't have any. You got a stock factory radio. You didn't build anything yourself. There's no, I don't see any issue. By the way, this is when the person said it was happening. Were you operating during that period of time? Well, that complaint may have been several months ago. How do you know whether you were operating during that period of time or not? That log would be a good indication of whether you're operating or not. That log would provide proof that you were or were not operating during that period of time. You probably won't get, and most interferences don't come from VHF, UHF rigs. Most interferences come from, if there is a real interference, comes from an HF rig, something operated at higher power. But if nothing else, it's if there's an interference complaint, it's a legal document, with prove that you were or were not operating. And if you were operating, if you were causing interference, that's good. Then you actually know it. Then you can look at it and see if there's something you need to do about it. In most cases, if you actually are interfering with somebody, it's probably their electronic device, not yours. But be civil. Operational issues. Having a log of past contacts is a nice resource, especially when you want to fill out the QSL cards that you may have taken months to arrive. Let's say you've talked to somebody in Slovenia and you want a QSL card. Y'all know what QSL cards are? Here's a few QSL cards. There's a couple things on the bottom of that. One on the bottom of that. Let's see what it says down there. Okay. You may collect these. You may do contesting. You may want to do a award. You may want to go for awards, some sort of award for working all countries or working all continents or things like this. It's nice to have that information. It's a nice place to put an information that says, I sent a QSL card to this guy, now I'm expecting one back. Or someone sent one to me. Let me verify that I actually did talk to that guy. I've gotten QSL cards in the mail of people I've never talked to before. Odds are good. What it is they used the wrong call sign. They had the wrong call sign on their log. But it's good proof. So you really don't want to acknowledge someone that said, I've talked to you, if you haven't really talked to them. Okay. So it's good for operational things. Personal. It's a history. It's a history of what you've done. Someone you want to take pride in. The people you've talked to. The nets you participated in. It's not necessary, but it's a nice convenience to do a log. What do you put in a log? Well, typically a log contains the time and date that you contacted, time and date of your QSO, who you talked to, the call sign, what frequency or what band you operated on, any signal reports that you may have gotten from this person. You got a strong signal, an S9, or you got an S5, you got a weak signal, what kind of reports you gave them, and any comments or remarks. There's been times on 20 meters in the evening that I've talked, and this has been a long time, I talked to a fellow in Idaho. And about a month later, I'm on 20 meters one evening, and I hear this call sign. I think, that sounds like a familiar call sign. So I page back, and sure enough, I talked to him. The guy's name was Herb. Herb worked for a lumber company in Idaho. He was a sales manager for a lumber company in Idaho. I had a bunch of personal information there. And it turns out he had a bunch of personal information about me. So we talked again for a while, and just like old friends. We became friends over the radio. It's nice to sometimes have that information. Remember, on 60 meters, if you're using anything other than a dipole antenna, you got to have some place to write that down. That's something that might go in your comments. If your frequency here is 60 meters, and you're using something other than a dipole, then that goes in the comments section of your log. If you're going to work on 60 meters, you probably ought to have a log. Also, if you remember, you're required to do an RF exposure evaluation as a ham to determine whether or not the power level you're running and the distance between you or your neighbors and your antenna is safe. You're required to do that. You're only required to do it once unless you make a change. If you change power, if you change antennas, you need to do it again to make sure that it's safe. And if it's not a safe level, then you need to make sure that you don't operate too long at any given frequency. Okay. Good place to record that as well. We talked about, remember your slash on the end of your AG? Who might be one of the people that might take exception or have question about that? Well, there's what's known as the Amateur Auxiliary to the Federal Communications Commission. The FCC isn't exclusive in monitoring the bands, the ham bands. Okay. The FCC encourages self-regulation and compliance of the amateur radio bands. And they do that. We have volunteers that do that. They're volunteer hams. They monitor the airwaves looking for violations. The American Radio Relay League, the ARRL, has, whoa, see what happened to the wrong button? There we go. The ARRL has a group of people that they call official observers, OOs. And official observers casually go through the band, and they go outside, up a little above the band limits and a little below our band limits and see if there's anybody up there or anybody's bleeding over into that. They'll periodically just look up a call sign and say, are they operating within their portion of this band chart? Are they operating where they belong? Looked up their call sign and they're general and they're in the extra class portion of the band. Or I looked up a call sign and they're a technician, they're operating on the general class portion of the band. Well, their job, and they'll send you a little card. If your name and address is in the database, they'll send you a little card saying, hey, on this day, you were operating outside, bleeding over outside of the end of the frequency. You were trying to operate on the very end of the edge of frequency band, you were bleeding over in the outside. It's not a fine. It's not an FCC warning. It's just courtesy. It's not a self-regulate and self-police. If tomorrow they go back on there and see you doing it again, they'll send you another one. If next week you do it again, they'll notify the FCC. And they'll make a record of that. Then the FCC will say, hey, here's the complaint on these dates. And maybe the FCC may monitor themselves as well. The FCC will monitor it and say, okay, on these dates you were operating on the outside of the band. I need you to tell me in writing within 30 days why and what you're going to do about it. Sometimes the answer is, oops, I'll remember to operate lower in the band from now on, and that's good enough. The one thing you want to do if you get a notification from the FCC, do not ignore it. Do not. Answer them. Because they'll give you a fine for the violation, and they'll give you another fine for ignoring it. Okay. A lot of times there's clowns out there who will willfully interfere with other stations. There are clowns out there, there are hateful, mean people who will willfully interfere with a racy storm spotter net. They'll laugh and they'll giggle and they'll play obscene tapes and stuff over the top of it while storm spotters are trying to work. Observers can find them real quick. One of the ways you find them is by using radio direction finding equipment. They'll have 2 or 3 hams come out and they'll triangulate that station to try to locate it. It's one of the things official observers do. Now, when you do that radio direction finding, how do you practice that? That takes some practice and takes a little bit of technique to do that. Well, a lot of clubs do what they call hidden transmitter hunts, also fox hunts. That's a good way to train. Periodically, maybe every couple of months, they'll place a transmitter someplace, and a bunch of people will try to find it. Well, they'll triangulate until they can find it and maybe give a prize or an award for whoever finds the location of that transmitter. Some cases, it's a sport. They actually have competition where they hide these things and people go try to find them. But it's good practice on getting proficient in locating stations. It's not only people who are malicious. In some cases, people like to leave the radio on their car all the time. No problem. The new ones don't run the batteries down. They'll leave the radio on in their car all the time and they're talking on a mic and they stick it down between the seat and the console. And it transmits. Okay? And it transmits and transmits and transmits and transmits and transmits till the repeater after 10 minutes, whatever it is, times out. If they're lucky, the radio won't burn up. Or someone will stuff it, throw it in a drawer. Have an HT turned on and throw it in a drawer. Or stick it in a purse. And it'll be transmitting. We've had repeaters tied up for a long period of time. Well, one of the ways you find those is you go on the input frequency of the repeater and you triangulate that station. You go find them and say, hey, you're transmitting. What's going on? There's all sorts of stories about stations that have been interfering, they've been hunted down, that strange stuff like the cat knocked something over, or one of the kids was playing with the transmitter or something like that. Or they stuffed it. To keep the kid from playing with the transmitter, they stuffed the microphone in a drawer, didn't turn the radio off, and the microphone transmitted. And then we went off on vacation. But hidden transmitter hunts are a good way to do direction finding. And remember, we police ourselves using amateur auxiliary. Emergency communications. We talked about this before, and we'll talk about it again. We talked about it during the technician training, and you know it as technicians. Emergency communications is job number one. Emergency communications takes precedence over all other communications. An emergency is a situation which poses immediate risk to health, life, or property. Not inconvenience, an immediate risk to health, life, or property. It takes precedence. If you hear somebody on or declare an emergency, help them out. Give them the frequency, help them out. What frequency do you use for emergency communication? What mode do you use for emergency communications? Which is the recommended frequency? What's the recommended mode? The recommended method? You use whatever has the best chance of working. If FM has the best chance of working, use FM. If VHF and UHF frequency have the best chance of working, use them. If an HF frequency has the best chance of working, use that. Remember, when we start learning about propagation a little later on, you're going to find out that some frequency bands are better suited for local communications, and some frequency bands are better suited for long distance communications. And in the high frequency band, some frequencies in there are good for short distance, and some frequencies are good for long distance, and it depends on the time of the day and what condition the sun's in. So the complex is a complex answer, but the simplified version is, for emergency communications, use whatever mode and whatever frequency has the best chance of getting that distress call through. When you're operating on voice, what are some of the criteria that you should keep in mind when you're operating on voice? Well, the first one is listen. And then listen some more. And then listen some more before you transmit. If you're on a repeater, you'll notice that a lot of times people will talk right back and forth. One person will just, when he drops the mic, the other person will pick it right up without leaving a break. Other people will pause a while. There's an advantage to pausing in case there's somebody else that needs to get in and wants to use the repeater or wants to join the conversation, and in case there's someone who wants to make an emergency call. And it bodes well to leave a little gap between your transmissions, because the person making an emergency call might not have the full power. He might be in a situation in which they're using an HT with a compromised antenna or something like that. They may be in a ditch in their car. Propagation is not going to be really good, and they pick up their HT, so their signal might be weak. So give them enough time to get in there. And if you do hear a signal, listen. On HF, it's possible that there's a conversation going on. We'll talk about skip and all that stuff later. It's possible on HF that if you want to use a frequency, that there's a conversation going on, but you can only hear half of the communications because of propagation. Listen for a little bit to see whether all of a sudden you hear somebody talking. The two people on the other ends are hearing each other perfect. You're maybe in a location in which you only hear one of them. Listen. And this is why you want to ask, even if you don't hear somebody. Ask if the frequency is in use, followed by your call sign. N5, there's this frequency in use. This is N5YM. Now, if there's a conversation going on and you only hear one half of the conversation, probably the other guy can hear you. And he'll come back and say, I'm talking with somebody else in this frequency. Okay, fine. Go pick another one. Don't operate too close to another station. If you hear another station operating, and they're on single sidebands, which you're going to be doing on most of your voice work, stay at least 3 kilohertz away, because that's the width of that single sideband signal. So you don't want your signal to overlap into theirs. So stay about 3 kilohertz away. Remember 2.8 was the one we used for the 60 meters, was the width of the signal? Well, if you say a single sideband signal is 2.8 kilohertz wide, okay, 3 kilohertz leaves us just a little bit of margin there, which is good. And don't get too close to the bandwidth. Remember, your signal has width. Okay, and let's use 3 kilohertz. If you go right up to the top end of the band, and you set your dial on that top end of the band, and you're using upper sideband, you're transmitting higher than your frequency that you see on the dial. If your dial is showing you a center frequency of a double sideband signal, you're going to be 3 kilohertz outside of the band. and you're going to get a little pink card from the official observer saying you're outside the band. And a lot of guys won't hear you because maybe they don't tune outside the band anyhow. Okay? We're going to talk about that right now. AM voice signal. AM voice signal is balanced modulation. What happens is you combine speech amplifier voice with the RF carrier. You take an RF carrier and you impose intelligence on it. You impose audio frequency on it. And that audio frequency, when you put those signals together, when you heterodyne, called heterodyning, when you mix those signals together, you get the original frequency, which is your carrier. You get the sum and the difference. So you get the original frequency, plus then you get the voice component, the sum of the voice component, and the difference of the voice component, which is upper and lower sideband. The information here is identical to the information there. When you transmit a conventional AM signal, you're transmitting the carrier frequency, you're transmitting intelligence, and intelligence again. You're transmitting twice as much as you need of the information. So you get the lower sideband, which is the one lower in frequency, the upper sideband, which is the one higher in frequency, and the carrier. So that lower sideband is the carrier frequency minus the voice frequency. The upper sideband is the carrier frequency plus the voice frequency. That uses a lot of RF space, a lot of space in the band. And by the way, why would you want to send the same information twice? That's double sideband AM. How about? And each one of those is about 300 kilohertz wide. And what you see, the display on your radio, the numbers that come up on your radio, is that me and that laser. I want to quit using that laser. Okay, here we go. What shows up on your radio, the frequency that shows up on the radio, is this one right here in the middle. That's the frequency that shows up in your dial. And then you're either using the upper or lower component. And when you're using AM, that's exactly what you want to see. You want to see the middle of the frequency. So let's help ourselves along a little bit by getting rid of one of those carriers, one of those sidebands. And by the way, we've already got the information. We don't even need the carrier. We don't need that center frequency. So all I'm going to transmit now is I'm going to transmit that single sideband. And by the way, the power that I used to transmit both of those signals, both the upper and lower and the carrier, upper and lower sideband, all that power is going to go into that lower sideband. So I'm putting all my power into a narrower space, much more efficient. So what single sideband is a suppressed, it's an AM with suppressed carrier and sideband. And I pick which one of these I want to use. Uses less bandwidth, it's narrower. All the power goes into the sideband. Inside my radio, there's filters in there that strip out the stuff I don't want. And in this case, I'm using lower sideband, which would be what frequencies?
Above.
Lower sideband.
Below 14 megahertz.
Most frequencies below 1400 megahertz, yeah. If I were operating above that and I switched to upper sideband, my radio would strip out this, the carrier, and give me the upper sideband. Kind of cool. The downside of it sounds kind of funny because I've taken the carrier out of there. Sounds like Donald Duck talking, but there's a way to fix that too. Okay about single sideband? Remember, lower sidebands, 160, 75, 75, 80. You'll hear that band down here around 3.5, I'm sorry. Yeah. 3.5 megahertz, this area here. You'll hear that referred to as either 75 or 80 meter band. It's kind of a traditional thing. And 40 meters are going to be lower sideband. 6 meters, and then 20 meters, which is 1400 megahertz and above, and everything above that is all going to be upper sideband. Why? Why did we do that? Because that's what hams decided they wanted to do. Current amateur, good operating procedure, good amateur radio practice. Remember, we tend to, and things what the FCC doesn't tell us what to do, we try to get together as a group and agree on stuff so we don't have chaos. There's nothing that prohibits you legally from operating upper sideband on 160 or 40 meters or 75, 80 meter band. Nothing legally that prevents you from doing that. The problem is everybody else is running lower sideband there and they won't be able to understand you. You know, when you're in lower sideband mode, you really can't understand upper sideband. You can't, your radio doesn't decode that properly, if you want to think of it that way. Let's take a look at this. We talked about it before. My frequency display displays where the carrier frequency would be at. And I'm on 40 meters. I'm on the lower port, so I'm going to be using lower sideband. And the bottom of the band is 7.175. If I want to operate single sideband in the bottom of the band, I cannot set my display to 7.175. What will happen if I do? That 3 kilohertz piece will be outside the band. I'll be transmitting everything outside the band. But I think I'm in the band because my display says I am. So you got to remember, don't operate too close to the band edge. And if you have to operate on the band edge, make sure you understand how to compensate for that. 3 kilohertz, right? Okay. Let's do the math. 7.175, which is the same as, let's convert it to kilohertz so we can use common value, is 71.75, plus 3 is 71.78. So 71, what I want to do is I want to have my frequency set to 71.78 at the lowest frequency, right? I want to set it up 3 kilohertz from the bottom of the band. That keeps me from operating out of the band, keeps me from being in violation. That's good practice. Let's talk a little bit about radios. Most radios, specifically HF radios, usually most of them have an opportunity to operate split frequencies. Some of them have 2 variable frequency oscillators in them, a primary and a secondary, so that you can transmit on one frequency and receive on another. Sort of like you do for repeaters. Only on HF, you're operating simplex, but you're transmitting on one frequency and operating on another. Well, I'll give you a possibility of this. Remember, we're in ITU Region 2. This is a good example. Here's just a wild example. We're in ITU Region 2. And I'm talking to someone that's in ITU Region 3. One of the things that they do in the ITU does is decide what these ham frequencies look like. Not every country has the same frequencies that we have. Some countries can legally operate on different frequencies than we do. And just not knowing specifically, let's just use an example. Let's say Japan has a little different frequency limit on their band than we do. And I want to talk to a guy in Japan, and I hear him outside my band. I want to talk to him. How do I talk to him? Well, I adjust mine so I talk to him inside my band. You may find out that if he's talking, he may be calling CQ, which is an invitation, CQ invitation to anybody that wants to talk to me, talk to me. He may be calling CQ, and he knows that CQ North America, he knows we can't operate outside the band, so he'll be listening for us inside our band limit. We can set one VFO to stay on frequency when we transmit, and the other VFO to listen out of frequency when we listen to him in his legal band. So it gives us an opportunity to do split frequencies. A lot of people who do contesting. Now, one of the things people want to do is do contesting. They want to talk to stations that's set up in a remote location that's rare. Some may go and they set up in some little atoll or island in the middle of the Pacific where there's no other hams. And they'll do what's called a de-expedition, where they'll purposely go there with the intention of setting up radios to talk to as many people around the world that wants to talk to them, that wants that rare place in the country, that wants a QSL card from some place that there's no hams. Once they get on there, they're besieged with people who want to talk. In a lot of cases, these people will actually receive on one frequency and talk on another. They'll call CQ and say, I'm listening on a different frequency, to kind of sort out the people who don't know what they're doing. And sure enough, even though he says, I'm listening on this frequency, you'll hear 100 stations transmit on the one that he's called on. But there'll be 5 or 6 that actually follow what he says to do, and he talks to them. So he kind of weeds out what we call the lids. But that's a possibility. So there's a number of reasons why we want to talk on one frequency and receive another, and split VFO is a way of doing it. Actually have 2 variable frequency oscillators in our radio that we can use. You're going to find your radios, HF radios, unlike your handy-talkies, unlike maybe your mobile radios, have meters on them to monitor your signal, whether it's a transmit signal or a receive signal, to monitor maybe the condition of your antenna, SWR, monitor a lot of things. They have multifunction meters. And a multifunction meter may be able to selected to either read as an S meter, and S meter is signal strength. Remember the S, signal strength. It may do ALC, automatic level control. Automatic level control. One of the things we're going to talk about in PSK 31 is if you're running automatic level control, you don't want to see your meter. You want to set it so your meter just barely doesn't move. That's the proper level for if you're doing a PSK digital signal. But automatic level control is something that keeps your radio from overmodulating. Overmodulating is not good. It sets it up so you get good modulation, a lot of voice power in your radio, but not too much. So that will measure that. You can adjust a knob that you can adjust that to set that to an optimal level. It may also measure transmit power, tell you how many watts that you're putting up, a relative, and it may also be able to set to see standing wave ratio. The health of your antenna system, the amount of reflected power that's coming back versus the amount that's going down, which we want to keep the amount going down to the maximum and the amount coming back to the minimum. So these multifunction meters can do all these things. And S means signal strength, ALC means automatic level control, SWR means standing wave ratio. Automatic level control is a useful feature of your transceiver to prevent overdriving and audio creating distortion to the transmit signal. It helps prevent flat topping and excessive gain. Excessive gain if you're using a linear amplifier. If you're using a linear amplifier, you don't want to overdrive that linear amplifier. That's something for sure. So what you do using that is you adjust your microphone gain for the optimum transmitted audio. And why you do that? Well, any of you been CBers before? Either one of you guys use CB? Okay, one of the things, there's a CBer. Increase the swing on your CB. Increase the modulation on your CB, you get out better. 100% modulation, no reason. Let me show you a little demo here that has to do with modulation. Your radio has circuits in it, and the circuits in those radios are designed to accept a certain amount of power, a certain amount of microphone power in the radio. And when they're absorbing that certain amount, they're not designed to use more than what the radio should be using to prevent proper modulation. So what you never want to exceed is 100% modulation. And you'll hear a CBer saying, I'm running 120%. I want 110, 115%. Well, the radio is only good for 100%. And let's use this glass as the radio, your drive circuitry in your radio. What happens to my signal when I use 50%? I'm fine. I'm not using all the power I can, but I'm okay. What happens when I increase my modulation to 75%? I'm still good. What happens when I increase my modulation to 100%? I'm still great. Now I'm going to get greedy and say, I'm really going to get my signal out. What happens when I increase my signal to 100%? There is no more than 100%. It won't take more than 100%. What's going to happen is that your signal, you see how the water or this liquid splattered out on the outside? Well, that's exactly the concept that we see on radios. We see splatter. Splatter is a distorted signal. Splatter goes outside the bandwidth. You don't want splatter. That comes from splatter is caused by excessive drive of your radio. What happens to the signal, instead of having a pure signal, you see on the picture here how these wavelengths, these waves here that have peaks on them that are full waves, all of a sudden they get up to 100% and they flat top out. They can't go any farther. The circuitry can't amplify anymore. And so you get a lot of splatter. You get flat topping. That's another thing it's called. What happens if you got a radio and you got a really, really strong signal nearby? You got and that signal is so strong that it's overwhelming your radio. It's overwhelming the front end, the amplifier on the front end of your radio. Well, what you might want to do is you might want to kind of put something in there to kind of reduce that signal coming in. And that's called an attenuator. If you've got a strong incoming signal like a neighbor next door who's also transmitting on the same frequencies you're transmitting on, he may overwhelm your radio. So you can use an attenuator, which helps reduce the signal coming in to keep from overloading your radio's front end amplifier. Here's the paradox. You have a radio here, and you have these radio waves, which are very, very, very minute potential levels. Microvolts of potential coming down your antenna. And what you want to do with your radio, the first thing you want to do is amplify them, get them up high enough that I can hear them on my radio, that I get a good signal. So you got this amplifier in the front of your radio. I take these very, very tiny spring signals and amplify them up to enough that it'll drive a speaker. And then you got somebody else transmitting a signal that's coming in, that's not microvolts, it's coming in volts in the front of your radio because they're so close and so powerful. Well, now your radio's trying to handle that too. So what you can do for that signal is press that attenuator button and select a level in which it won't overwhelm your radio anymore. Kind of like a resistor in the front of your radio. That's what an attenuator does. Remember, the S meter indicates signal strength. It's calibrated in 0 to 9 and then dB over 9. Okay? And it's in dBs or decibel. So example, a 20 dB signal over S9 is 100 times greater than S9. You may hear someone say you're 5 over 9. That means my radio says you're 5 dBs over 9 dBs. 5 over 9. We talk about dBs. I think we're going to talk about that a little later. We'll talk about what they are. But each 20 dB, for example, is equal to 100 times increase in signal level. So often a test they ask you if 20 dB over 9, 20 dB is 100. Also things called a notch filter. Let's say we talk about there's a lot of frequencies, a lot of bands really popular, propagation's really good. You're on the 20 meter band and there's a lot of other people on there as well. In your pass band, in the band of your radio is receiving a certain width frequency at all times. It's not receiving everything at once. It's only receiving, if you turn the dial, it's receiving a certain width. In that, there's a lot of interference. You can use a notch filter to kind of notch that out. Kind of take a little piece out. That is usually part of the DSP, digital signal processing function. And its job of a notch filter is to reduce interference from carriers in that received band. You can take that particular carrier that's interfering with you and just make it disappear. Notch it right out of the frequency band. So what it does is passes most frequencies unaltered, but attenuates those in a specific range. I get everything else and I got one that's bothering me, I just notch that sucker right out. Talked about a digital signal processor. These are really neat. These are almost magic. Digital signal processing will take signals that are pretty much garbage, with a lot of interference and a lot of noise, and might be ignition noise and heterodynes from other stations and who knows what, and manipulate those signals to reduce or take those out. What you have is you have the audio comes in, it's analog, audio in your radio is analog. It goes through a analog to digital converter. An analog to digital converter is a converter that takes that analog signal and slices it up in a whole bunch of little slices. Like you slice up a ham or slice up bologna. Slice it up in a whole bunch of slices. And then each one of those slices, the peak value of that slice, it assigns a number to that, a value based on its strength. So it has now your signal's a bunch of numbers. It takes those numbers and puts it into the computer, which is a digital signal processor. And a digital signal processor now can take those numbers and work with those numbers to do things you ask it to do, like take out interference. Once you've got that signal processed, you can't hear it because it's a digital signal. It goes to a digital analog converter, which takes those numbers and converts them back into an analog sine wave again. And now it comes out the audio you're looking audio that you're interested in. So it takes this analog signal, converts it to digital data where it manipulates it, takes the noise out, notches out the interfering carriers, changes the bandwidth, comes up with a modified signal, converts it back to an analog signal, and passes it on through your radio. So that can cure a lot of problems. If you have a radio or you're going to buy an HF radio, I highly recommend that when you do so, you make sure that it has digital signal processing in it. The very low-end radios, very inexpensive radios that you can buy, HF radios you can buy, are good radios, but some of those lack digital signal processing. There's nothing wrong with buying an older used radio as well. Try to buy one that has digital signal processing. If not, you'll want to end up buying a DSP processor to add on to the end of it. Digital signal processing is pretty cool. We're ready to review? All right, let's talk about what we learned. How close to the lower edge of the 40-meter general class phone segment should your display carrier read when you're using a 3 kilohertz wide lower sideband signal? 3 kilohertz above the edge of the signal, 3 kilohertz below the edge of the signal. Your display carrier may be set right on the edge, or center your signal on the edge of the segment. Remember, we're on the 40 meter. Remember, we're using lower sideband, and we're talking about the lower edge of the band. What do we think? A? Sure. You want to stay above it. So you want to make sure that you set 3 kilohertz above that lower edge of the band. What's the purpose of using automatic level control with the RF power amplifier? To balance the transmitter audio frequency response, to reduce harmonic radiation, to reduce distortion due to excessive drive, distortion is like splatter, to increase overall efficiency. Why do you want to not overdrive your radio? We talked about splatter, we talked about flat topping, we talked about reducing distortion due to excessive drive. What does an S meter measure? Conductance, impedance, receiver signal strength, or transmitter power output?
C.
S, strength. What's the reason to use the attenuator function that's present on many HF transceivers? To reduce signal overload from strong incoming signals, to reduce your transmitting power when transmitting into a linear amplifier, to reduce power consumption when using batteries, or to slow down CW signals for a better copy. Wouldn't that be nice? Slow down. Dit. What do you think? This is to reduce those strong signals that may be coming in, the ones that are too strong, that are just overloading your receiver. What's the primary feature and purpose of a notch filter? To make your bandwidth, your transmitter narrower, to reduce interference from carriers in your bandwidth, to eliminate receiver interference from impulse noise sources, or to enhance reception of specific frequency on a crowded band.
B and D both look almost equivalent. Now, there's something tricky about one of them.
Mm-hmm. What do you think?
Seems like D is a little more general than B, but
Actually, D is a little more specific. We're talking about, first of all, the bandwidth. Okay, and I may be several signals in that bandwidth. Okay, all right. So I've got several signals in that bandwidth that I want to deal with. Okay, or I want to in that bandwidth I want to make only one primary. Well, a notch filter notches out a frequency. So if I've got several frequencies in this bandwidth and I want to take one of them out, notch that out, I de-enhance a frequency rather than enhance it. I leave the rest of them the same. Notch filter takes them out. So that's why
it must be B.
B is correct.
Let's see.
That's the reason that's the reason I put that question in here.
Can you say what number question that is in the book?
Oh, not offhand. I'd have to look at that.
What is the purpose of a notch filter?
Mm-hmm. Okay, what control is typically adjusted for proper automatic level control setting on an amateur signal sideband transceiver? Remember, automatic levels control setting is the level of modulation, the level of voice strength that that we're talking about. So, what control do we use? Do we use the RF clipping level? Do we use the transmitter audio gain or microphone gain? Do we use the antenna inductance, or do we use the attenuator?
D.
Attenuator signal coming in. Remember, what we're trying to do is keep from setting our voice level too high, to keep from modulating over 100% and splattering. And our voice level, it comes from where? Where's our voice come through? In the radio. How's it get in the radio?
Microphone.
The microphone, right. The ALC, if you look at that meter on there, it's either going to be an audio gain control or there's going to be a microphone gain control, and you're going to set that for the proper level that you don't overmodulate. And that level, there'll be markings on that meter, and you'll want to look in your operating manual that comes with that radio and find out what they consider to be the optimal level, what number on the dial, what number on the meter is the level that they consider to be optimal and or for you not to exceed. And they'll tell you on basic modes you're in what level you should be setting it at. What frequency should be used to send a distress call? Whatever's the best chance of getting through. Only frequencies authorized for RACES or ARES. Only frequencies within your operating privileges. Only frequencies used by police, fire, or emergency. Some of those sound good, but remember they say only. Which one do you think? Whatever does the job. Remember, in the case of a true emergency, communications emergency, you are allowed to use any mode, any frequency, any means necessary to get the message through, whether it's inside your bandwidth or outside. If it happens to be a police radio, you can use it. If it happens to be a fire radio, you can use it. Whatever it is, you can use it. However, only when no other means are available. If I've got a perfectly good operating cell phone here and I can call 911, I am not going to pick up a police radio and call 911 on it. But as far as the frequencies go, what frequencies you use, any frequency, whatever mode gets the job best done. And for you, if you got two options, you got ham radio and you got police radio, you're authorized to use the ham radio. Odds are good you know how to use that much better than you know how to use the police radio, then that's the best one for you to use. What is the amateur auxiliary to the FCC? Volunteers enlisted to monitor the airwaves for rule violations, volunteers who conduct license examinations, volunteers who conduct frequency coordination for amateur VHF repeaters, volunteers who use their station to help civil defense organizations time of emergency. Who is the amateur auxiliary to the FCC? That's right. And we also call them official observers, OOs. They're listed to monitor airways for rules violations. Formally. They're part of an organization that does that. If you decide one day that you want to do rules violations and you're not part of an organization, that's all fine and good. If you're not part of an official organization, don't go sending somebody a notice. What frequency range is occupied by a 3 kilohertz lower sideband signal when the displayed carrier frequency is set to 7.178? Lower sideband, 3 kilohertz wide. What's the frequency range that carrier is in? Oh, that sideband is in. Which one? C. Did the math on that? Came up with C. You're right. Which of the following phone emissions use the narrowest frequency bandwidth? Single sideband, double sideband, phase modulation, frequency modulation.
Okay.
Single sideband is half double sideband, so right away you know that you throw that out. FM is broad as a barn. Phase modulation depends on the phase, so single sideband is the right answer. We talked about PSK 31, digital signal. How should the transmitter audio input, the ALC meter, be adjusted when transmitting PSK 31 data? So that the transceiver is rated at minimum output power, so that the transceiver ALC system doesn't operate, the meter just doesn't move, so that the transceiver operates at no more than 25% of the radiated power, or so that the transceiver ALC indicator shows half scale. Just when you see it move and you keep cranking it down until it stops moving, then you're right on the edge there. You don't want, with a PSK signal, it's a kind of pure signal, you don't want the automatic level control, which is trying to control, which is going to be fighting you. You don't want it to activate. You don't want it to fight your signal. ALC is going to try to keep your signal lower than 100%. Try to prevent splatter unless you override it, unless you set it too high. What skills learned during hidden transmitter hunts have helped to the amateur auxiliary? ID of out-of-band operation, direction finding used to locate stations violating the rules, ID of different call signs, or hunters who have an opportunity to transmit on non-amateur frequencies. Hidden transmitter hunts, they do direction finding. You're right. What's meant by the term flat topping, referring to a single sideband signal? Signal distortion caused by insufficient collector current. The transmitter's automatic level control, the ALC, is properly adjusted. Signal distortion caused by excessive drive, or the transmitter's carrier is properly suppressed. What do you think? C. You drove it so hard that it couldn't go anymore and it flap-topped. You exceeded the design and the components in the circuitry to the point where it just flattened it right out, saturated it. Questions? Discussion? Yeah.
One quick question, hopefully. The band rules that are not FCC, but I guess
Yeah.
the guys have gotten together and decided on, USB above 14 megahertz
Mhm.
and LSB below that. Why did they make a break there? Is there a technical reason for it? Why did they decide, why didn't they just go LSB all the way or USB all the way? Was there a reason for that?
That's really not clear. It's just kind of convention. When most of the developments that are happening in ham radio have been developed by hams, and or if they haven't been developed by hams, they were developed by someone, but they were then expanded and amplified and put in practice by hams. Someone may have come up with an idea and the hams put it and actually made it useful. And back at the time that they did that, that was what they decided to do. Now, I'm not sure whether or not it was a situation in which they started on a specific band or not, and that's what they picked, but it's convention is really what it is. It's convention. There's no real good explanation why that happened that way.
Just to make it tough on the guys taking exams?
Yeah, just to make it tough on the guy. Yeah.
Wahaha.
Yeah. Well, there was a time in which the ability that we have now to buy a rig that operates on 160 meters through 70 centimeters on one radio just by turning the dial, and we don't have to no finals that we have to load, no grids we have to dip. It's really simple. It's almost like an appliance. That's a luxury that in the earlier days, in the 40s and the 50s in ham radio, they didn't necessarily have. They had one transmitter and they had one receiver, and it might have been crystal controlled. And that ability to just jump from one band to another was pretty was only for the rich people. So most hams only operated a very few bands. They had an antenna cut, they had a transmitter and a receiver, and they had their favorite bands, and they only operated just a few bands. And there's a possibility that those particular bands were the first ones that implemented single sideband, and they just picked upper and lower sideband, and somebody else, when they implemented another one, another group implemented a different one. But it's convention that's happened over the years. Sort of like why we talk about wavelength and meters. It's tradition and convention. But we've all agreed upon it. So, as I said, it's not illegal, but you just won't be able to, if you're operating on the wrong sideband, you won't be able to hear a guy. And if you're operating on a radio and you just can't tune a signal in, somehow you got a single sideband signal, you just can't tune it in to make sense of it, either you're on the wrong sideband or they are. That's the first place to look. Probably nothing wrong with your radio. One of the two of you happen to be on the wrong sideband. We'll take a break and we'll roll.
Keep going.
Okay, let's roll. We'll talk a little about digital. CW. CW continuous wave, Morse code. That is the original digital mode. CW is the original digital mode. It's an extremely narrow bandwidth. It's just a carrier being turned off and on in some agreed to pattern that represents letters. The fact that it's so noisy, so narrow, is that you're just, when you're transmitting and receiving CW, you set your radio up to only transmit and receive in a very narrow piece of the bandwidth. So a lot of the noise that's surrounding you, you won't hear. So during noisy conditions, CW often can get through when most other modes can't. There are diehard CW operators who will say CW always gets through when any other mode can't, and that's not true now. It was true in the past. It's not true now. There are digital modes now that will get through. Now, CW requires you to hear it. There are digital modes now that can get through so weak that you can't hear them, and they'll still get through. PSK31 is an example. We were going to do a PSK31 demo here. I've set up an HF radio. We were going to do a demo. Unfortunately, inside this building, I get no radio signals and lots of interference. So we can't do the demo. But I was going to show you how you could see when you loaded up the software for PSK31 or able to visualize all the signals, how you can visualize a signal that you can't hear on that's weak enough that you can't hear on the speaker, but still you get a fairly good copy. But nevertheless, CW didn't require any special equipment other than a receiver. It requires knowledge. You need to know how a Morse code sounds like. You need to be able to make the connection between this pattern of dots and dashes or longs and charts, or carrier on and carrier off, and the letter that it represents, and string all those together. But it's the simplest mode, and it was one of the original modes because it was so simple. And a lot of people, you're not required to learn any CW, pass any kind of Morse code test to get any ham license anymore. When I started, I had to take the novice with a 5-word per minute code test. Then I took the technician exam. Then I took the general exam, but I had to pass a 13-word per minute code test. Then I took the advanced exam. Then I went to take the extra exam and I had to pass a 20-word per minute code test. And it didn't make me any better operator at all to know that CW, and I don't use it much anymore. But there are people, even though you don't have to use CW, there are still thousands of people who only operate CW because that's what they love. And if you go into and look up some of the contests, now you all know what contests are, okay? You look up some of the operating contests, and QST magazine is a good place to look in them. Look up some of the operating contests, and usually in a month, at least half of the operating contests are CW only. It's still that popular. And there's still bands set off aside to use it. But CW, that's your original digital mode, either on or off. That's what a digital signal is. It's either high potential, low potential, a plus or a minus, a 1 or a 0, on or off. That's what digital is all about. And CW is the original. One of the reasons, good reason to know CW, two, is that if you're traveling around, most repeaters identify with CW. So if you're traveling and you want to know you got the right repeater, you might want to know a little bit of CW. It doesn't hurt to learn CW, even though you don't have to. You might find that you fall in love with it. If you're going to operate CW, here's the guidelines. Match the speed of the person you're talking to. If someone sends you a CQ, and you want to answer the CQ, and they're sending it 7 words a minute, don't answer them at 20. If they wanted to operate 20 minutes a minute, they would have sent you a CQ at 20 minutes a minute. Don't answer them at 20. Because if you answer them at 20, they will not answer you back. If you're in a conversation with another station, and you start off at 7, halfway through, don't jump up to 15. Because if you jump up to 15, the response from that other station is going to be QRS, which is a Q signal for send slower. And if you don't send slower, they'll simply sign off and go away. And what you want to do too, if you're going to send CQ, usually people can send faster than they can receive. Usually they can think ahead of what they want to send, as they're a letter or two ahead, so they can really rattle off CW. But on the other hand, when you receive it, you're receiving behind now. Now your signals come in, you got to decode it before the next one comes along. Even though you can send faster than you receive, you're going to be in trouble if you send a CQ at 20 words a minute, but you can only receive at 10. The guy's going to answer you at the same speed, you're not going to know what they're saying. So match your speed to the other station, to the other operator. Use the same. Send the speed at the speed you want to receive, and don't answer someone who is sending slow. If you don't want to send slow, don't answer their CQ at a higher speed level on CW. That's kind of courtesy. Some people are mean. I mean, they'll do that. They'll get halfway through a conversation and all of a sudden speed up. No, but they just want to show off. Maintain 100 to 500 hertz spacing from other stations. Before we've been talking about kilohertz, we're talking about cycles per second. That's how narrow these are. You can cram a lot of those, but don't get right up next to another CW signal. When you're transmitting, try to zero beat the other station. When you're answering a station, set your frequency to the same frequency that you're receiving on. Try not to transmit off frequency. Because remember, they've got this receiver set to a very narrow bandwidth for CW. If you get too far off frequency, they're not going to hear you. So try to transmit and receive in the same frequency. The old days, because this is not the old days anymore. The old days, a lot of radios were crystal controlled. I may have had different crystals than you had. How did we communicate? Well, I'd call CQ, and then I'd listen. You'd hear me. And I'd call CQ, and if I didn't hear somebody, I'd start tuning up and down the bands. Listens for somebody, and I hear my call sign. It's on a different frequency. And I've got a separate receiver and a separate transmitter because we didn't have, so I would receive on one frequency because that's the one, that crystal that person had, and he would receive on my frequency. That's the way it used to be. Nowadays, we don't do, nobody runs crystal controlled anymore, and if they do, on those radios, CW radios are crystal controlled, almost every one of them are on the same frequency. If you buy a small, low power QRP radio, there's QRP meaning low power. Okay. And typically CW is a popular mode to operate low power because it gets through better with low power than higher frequency, than other modes do. There are sections of the band, of each band, that operators have agreed on that will operate QRP in those sections of the band. Just like digital, there's other sections that are for agreed to low power. So if you've got a simple crystal controlled radio, $10 radio, you can do work HF on $10, $10 transceiver. They're very simple, but they're crystal controlled. They're very low power, but they all operate on just about the same frequency. So you got one frequency to operate on if you're operating on that. So, but you're matching frequency. Make sure you zero beat and use the same frequency that the other operator is using so that they can hear you and don't have to keep tuning their radio up and down the band. Because when they tune their radio in to clarify your signal, they also move the transmitter at the same time. In CW, there's Q signals. These Q signals were developed years ago by the telegraph operators to not have to send a whole lot of information. Okay, let's take a look at this. Let's pick one out. QRQ, send faster. Okay. If I'm a radio operator and I want to send information efficiently, or I'm a telegraph operator, I want to send information efficiently, do I want to send S, E, N, D, F, A, S, T, E, and R? Or do I want to just send QRQ? QRV, look at all the letters I'm going to have to send when I can send this abbreviation to begin with. They started them all out with Qs so that they knew that was a designation for identifier, for CW identifiers. They're a shorthand. QSL means I acknowledge receipt. Those QSL cards are acknowledgments of my transmission. QRQ, send faster. QRS, send slower. Whenever I'm on CW, I send that a lot. I always want somebody to send slower. QRV, I'm ready to receive a message. You may be passing information back and forth in a net, and someone says, okay, they may send QRV question mark, are you ready to receive a message? And I'll send QRV back without a question mark saying I am. QRP, decrease power. So if you want to ask someone to decrease power, or it's also used as an acronym for the use of decreased power for low power rigs, QRP. Don't use these for voice. Generally, don't use these for voice. AR, that's the code says that I'm finished, I'm ending my message. The message that I'm sending you, I'm finished with. CL means I'm closing my station down. I may end the message without closing my station. But CL means I'm closing down my station. I'm gone. Shutting the power off. DX means long distance. KN means I'm listening for specific stations. If I send CQ on CW and I only want to listen for North America, I may say my call sign CQ, my call sign KN, North America. That I'm only interested in talking to North America. SK silent key also means I'm closing down. And that also refers to a deceased ham, is known as the silent key. We talk about PSK31. PSK31 is a recent digital mode. It's pretty cool. It's called PSK31 because of the characteristics. The 31 indicates that it sends 31 characters per second. This is a computerized mode, and it sends 31 characters per second. That's pretty low speed. And with that low speed and digital, I can use a very, very small bandwidth. Remember, the higher the character rate, you probably learned this in a technician, the higher the character rate I send, the wider the bandwidth gets. So I want to keep my my bandwidth narrow, and I want to keep it down. Okay. So 31 characters per second, and PSK means phase shift keying. It differentiates between a plus and minus or a minus and plus by changing the phase of the signal. It's a keyboard-to-keyboard mode. When I'm in a conversation with someone using PSK31, whatever I type on the keyboard is converted to a letter and sent to them, and they're reading it. They can see me type. They're reading it as I type. It's not like packet, it's not like text message where you gather it all up and send it at once. It's keyboard to keyboard. As you type, you see it on the other end. It's a varicode. Varicode's cool. There are some letters in the English language that are used more often than others. All the vowels, S, M's, things like that, N, those are all used more frequently. So what they do with those is they make them smaller. The number of bits they're reckoning to represent a T, for example, are fewer bits, because T is used more often, are fewer bits than, for example, an X or an L. So it increases the efficiency by making those letters that are sent more often shorter letters. You get more bang for your buck. You get more than that 31. It's a simple interface. If you have a laptop with some free software, there's all sorts of free software out there, have a laptop and a radio, you can do PSK31. The interface is pretty simple. There's a complete PSK31 interface. This one here plugs into the speaker jack on my computer. The other end plugs into the microphone jack on my computer. This plugs into the data port on the back of my radio. This is called a DIN plug also. It's a multi-conductor plug used for audio transmission, a DIN plug. This is a really simple little device in here. It's got a couple transformers and a little device to trigger my push-to-talk off and on. That's a PSK31 interface. They can be had for, if you want to build your own, you can build one for about $15, $20. If you want to buy one, you can buy one for starting about $70 up to several $100, depending on how exotic you want them to be. But it's pretty cool. Sound card. It uses a sound card in your computer to generate these signals, to generate the tones. It uses a sound card in the computer to generate the software in your computer to generate the varicode. It doesn't have any error correction though. If noise tends to wipe out some of your bits, some of your transmission, you'll get kind of little pieces of garbage on your screen. So you may not get 100% copy, but usually you get enough copy to understand everything that's being said. And as a good operator, if you realize that something might get dropped out every once in a while, you might want to keep in mind, what if 2 or 3% of my signal gets dropped out? What portions of that signal is not important? Well, if I live in Connecticut and I put my location as Connecticut, I really don't care if I get enough letters. The guy on the other end is going to know if an N drops out or an O drops out. He's going to know that. If I send my call sign, maybe part of my call sign drops out. Every letter of that call sign is important. So if I'm on PSK31, there are some things I may want to repeat. Call sign is N5YR and N5YM, just to be on the safe side. That's kind of a technique that you learn. But this is really neat. This is great for people who have mic fright, who are afraid of picking up a mic. Okay, talk on your computer. These are really friendly people. They're doing the same thing that you're doing because they want to do the same thing that you're doing. Maybe they got mic fright too. The other nice thing about this is you don't have to type everything. This software uses the control keys on your keyboard. You can build canned messages. You can build macros, where you can say, my location is. Okay, and rather than have to type it every time, when you get to that point in the conversation, you press that button, it loads that in and sends it out for you. My call sign is, or if you want to send CQ over and over and over again, yes, CQ, 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 this is my call sign, my call sign, my call sign. Okay, press the button. So it's a really neat, it's cheap to operate. If you've got a radio, another few bucks will allow you to get on the digital modes. Remember, narrow bandwidth, because lower symbol rate means a narrower bandwidth, a higher symbol rate gives you a higher bandwidth. That's what it sounds like. On the software, this screen scrolls up. This is a band scope. It's looking at the band. Here it says 14.071, 14.072. Remember 14.07 is down here someplace, okay? This is looking at a piece of the band. You get to see a piece of the band and all the signals that are in that piece of the band. And as this thing scrolls up, that's a signal. It tends to have a good PSK signal, has what they call a railroad track or a ladder type look to it. See how it looks like two rails with ladder and this is a weaker one, but you can see it here. Railroad tracks, a ladder look, two vertical lines with it's like ties or ladder steps in between. That's a good signal. Okay, that's an easy signal to demodulate. If you overmodulate that signal, if you set the drive too high, if you set your audio gain too high, you get this mushy thing. See all that splatter outside? This is a visible example of splatter. Okay? You get those signals there, you can't decode very well. And as these go through, here's the neat thing about it. Okay, let's say you want to receive this signal right here. Just set your mouse, put your mouse right over that signal and click on it, and that software will adjust and start receiving that signal. All this for free and free software on a cheap interface on your computer. And that's what you heard what it sounded like. It uses a digital mode interface. This one here runs about, this is a prepackaged one. Oop, back up. That's a prepackaged one. It runs about $115 with cables. That particular USB interface. That one uses just the USB. Doesn't need the audio cables. Uses a USB cable to your computer and another cable to the transceiver. It has a sound card built in, or it doesn't even need to use your computer sound card. Nice thing about that, it works at extra expense to set this once for your radio, and then you use any computer with it you want. But again, this is a medium range, around $100. Something like that there can be bought in a kit for about $30. You can build something for less than 10. And remember we showed you that DIN cable, that DIN? Okay, that's a DIN cable. That's an audio cable. That's a cable that's designed for audio use because it's taking the audio and sending it into your computer. And it uses MFSK, multiple frequency shift keying. That's what the example is. It has great weak signal performance. These are one of them that sometimes when we went back to here, let's go back to here. It's possible that that signal right there can't be heard. When you click on that, if you turn your speaker on, it's possible that that signal can't be heard because it's weak, or maybe I think I'm back on the air. There we go. Or maybe this signal can't be heard. It's too weak to be heard. But if you click on that, you'll probably get most of the characters in there. That's one of the examples of stuff that's even better than CW, because you got to be able to hear CW to decode it. This stuff here, stuff that's too weak to even be heard, can still be decoded by this software. Another digital mode is radio teletype. Radio teletype uses the Baudot code, which is a 5-bit data code. It has 5 data bits and 1 start-stop bit. It uses 170 hertz as the frequency, and it shifts that frequency back and forth to define the data bits. It normally uses lower sideband. And you hook it up to your radio with a whole different thing called a TNC, a terminal node controller. This is what a terminal node controller looks like. Terminal node controllers are used for radio teletype. Terminal node controller can be used for packet radio as well. It's important to remember that the Baudot code is a 5 data bit code. That's what it looks like. It used to put that, y'all come remember back when there used to be teletype machines with these paper tapes on them? Well, that's what it used. Code like that in the paper tape. The number of holes that you punched in that tape and the location of the holes in that tape. Seemed to come from right here. Right here? I don't know.
Sounds like it came from here, but
Oh, that was what, yeah, I'm sorry. Let's go back and do it again. That's what it sounds like. You'll hear it in a minute. The number of holes and the location of the holes in the tape, that's what determines each of the characters. And it uses a parity. They're either always going to be an even number of holes or an odd number of holes. There you go. That's what it sounds like. Below 10 meters, it's limited to 300 baud to keep the bandwidth narrow. 10 meters and 2 meters, it's limited to 1200 baud because there's a little more real estate up there. On 220 or 1.25 meters and 70 centimeters, you can use 56 kilobaud, which is a faster rate because there's a lot more RF real estate up there to use. That's AMTOR, Amateur Teleprinting over Radio. Similar to radio teletype, but it has the ability to check for data errors. And what it does is that when it sends data, it sends what's called an ARQ mode, an automatic repeat request. And the station on the other end, the signal will be formatted into such with information, checksum information with that signal that says, we take the data we sent and we do a mathematical computation of all the letters, and it comes out with a specific number. And I send that number along with my data. And when you receive it on the other end, you do that computation again. Your equipment does that computation again. And if the two numbers agree, it knows it got good signal, 100% signal. And it sends back something called ACK. Sends back an ACK, a knowledge character that says, okay, I got the data, it was good, send me some more. Because what it does is you heard that thing go pulse like that? It's taking the information, your text, and chopping it up in pieces and sending those pieces along. And then if it gets a knack, which says, hey, my number and your number didn't agree, then it resends that again, a not acknowledged. So it's kind of cool, it's got error correction in it. Not forward error correction, backward error correction, but at least it's able to determine whether it has a complete full copy, a solid copy, or whether it doesn't. Either ACK, which means acknowledge, or NAC, which means not acknowledge. That's packet radio. Packet radio is something that we use a lot. We use it a lot now for position reporting. APRS, they call it, automatic packet position reporting system. And we use that a lot. It differs from the character at a time thing like radio teletype and CW. What it'll take is you can type a whole message. For example, if you're sending a message, you can compose a whole message on the keyboard and say send. Okay. The controller software, and it uses a TNC as well, the controller software will take a hunk of it. It'll convert that data that to numeric data representing your letters, and it'll make a pack of information. It'll put some information on the front called a header. And the header says, where is this information going? Okay, routing information. And how do you handle it? Where does it go? Then it has the payload, which is the information itself, the actual data. And then it has that check information on the end. That computation of all that information there to begin with comes up with a number, checksum number, has that information on the end, it sends it out. Okay. And it goes someplace. You can route it someplace. Not just anybody that receives it. It can actually be sent to a specific location where it'll pop back up again. The good thing about that is the receiver on the other end will do the same thing. If it checksum matches and it's got a full copy, it'll say, great, send me some more. If not, it'll send this whole thing over again. It'll keep doing that in pieces and little packets of information. It'll keep doing that until it's completed the message. And the message gets through clear, or it doesn't get through at all. And you can route, this is the nice thing about that, with this routing information and a packet system, you can have what's called bulletin boards or post office boxes. And it will take, if you're not on the air, it'll take your messages and store them in a particular area. You can go get them if you want. Or it'll broadcast it for everybody, depending on how that heading information is set. A perfect example, packet. We call it text messaging today. Long before everybody walked around like this, 25 years before that, hams were doing it. The reason this works so well is because hams refined the system so well. Text messaging is packet. Okay on packet? PACTOR, the combination of packet and AMTOR. PACTOR provides improved throughput because the transmission speed adapts to the quality of the link. It uses compressed characters and operates off half duplex links and uses an automatic repeat request protocol like packet did, where I got the whole signal, I'm okay, send me some more, or I didn't get it, repeat it again. The thing about this is that all the other modes we've talked about are a constant rate data. Packet will adjust, PACTOR, which is really complex, and the TNC that you can use for packet radio will run you a couple of $100. The TNC that you want to use for PACTOR will run you well over $1,000 because it's more complicated. But it adjusts the transmission speed. If band's good, it'll send faster. If bands are bad, it'll send slower. And it uses an automatic repeat request. So it's a combination. A PACTOR, a packet radio, still sends packets of information. It doesn't send them one at a time. It sends a packet of information. And it also can adjust the speed. There's a new technology out called software-defined radio. If you open up an old radio, you're going to find it's all full of a bunch of coils and a bunch of capacitors and a whole bunch of stuff. And older the radio, you'll find that every band had a inductor or a couple inductors and some capacitors that were tuned for that particular band. And you had a band switch on the front that selected all of those groups. And the component, you selected different pieces. In other words, you had a radio that maybe had 2, 3, 4, 5 different little sub-radios inside of it for different bands. It was all done by hardware. A new technology called software-defined radio, in which most of that is now done by computer, by DSP, by signal processing. These radios here claim to be SDR radios, these little Japanese radios, to an extent they are. If they want to change bands on this, they flash new software to it. They don't change the components. SDR radios are pretty cool. Most of everything's been done by performance. Some radios are strictly SDR only. They need a computer interface to work. Other radios have SDR built into them. They're SDR and you don't see it. A Linko radio, for example, You buy an Alinco radio, that SDR8, and if Alinco comes up with new capabilities for that radio, you can download the new capabilities from that radio, flash the memory in your radio, and you got new capabilities. Tentec is a company that's just pioneered that. They upgrade their radios over the internet. Their SDR, they flash new information onto your radio. Has some advantages. The FCC is really pushing hard to have more people, more manufacturers implement SDR. There's an ulterior motive behind that. Right now, they don't dare take a segment of ham band and move it someplace else. They want to have a frequency in here that they want to sell to somebody or use for something. They don't dare take 40 meters and move it down to 42 or 43, because they have thousands and thousands of people who have money invested in that, who are providing services to the government free of charge with their own equipment. However, once we get software-defined radios, it's not a big deal. We want to move a whole band? Okay, everybody just flash the new frequencies in their radio, trim your antenna, and away you go. They're becoming cheaper and cheaper. You can buy a nice 3-band software-defined radio for about $135 now. They're low power, but they're kind of cool. They run all sorts of CW, AM, FM, PSK31, digital modes, run all sorts of stuff. Or you can buy higher power ones if you want to pay $1,100, $1,200 and want to operate off a computer, rather than off a microphone. Or you can buy radios that's got them in them. Software-defined radios is the wave of the future. And typically when you buy a radio like this, you won't buy it as a software-defined radio. We just buy a radio and it's got software in it. It's just a selling point, it's a feature. This one here, Flex Radio, you'll buy it because it is a software-defined radio. Let's do a review. What's a practical way to avoid harmful interference when selecting a frequency to call CQ on CW phone? Send QRL, now CW or phone, either one of them. Send QRL on CW followed by your call sign, or if you're using phone, ask if the frequency is in use followed by your call sign. Listen for 2 minutes before calling CQ. Send the letter V in Morse code several times, listening for a response. Send QSY on CW if using phone. Announce the frequency is in use. Then send your call and listen for a response. Said a lot of stuff there. What's QRL mean? QRL meant, is this frequency in use? What's the most practical way of doing this? I'll give you a hint.
No, it's not C.
Yeah. Hey. Yep. No, it's not C. It's not QSY means I'm changing frequencies. And you don't want to announce the frequencies in use before you use it. So listen is good, but remember, listening doesn't necessarily mean you're always going to hear the other guy on there. And Beth, I say guy just as a general term. I don't mean anything other than that. What should you do if a CW station sends QRS? Send slower, change frequency, increase your power, repeat everything twice.
Send slower.
S for slower, yes. What pro sign is used to indicate the end of a formal message using CW? SK, BK, AR, or KN? AR. All right, it's your turn. What does a Q signal, QSL, mean? Send slower. We have already confirmed you by card. I acknowledge your receipt. We have worked before.
C.
I acknowledge receipt. What's QRP? Remote powered aircraft, low power transmission using quick response protocol. What's that? Traffic relay procedure net operation.
B.
Low power, QRP. What part of the data packet contains the routing information and handling information? The directory, the preamble, the header, or the footer?
C.
There's no directory, there's no preamble, there's no footer. The only thing in that, only one of those is correct. You don't have to even guess. The only one correct is the header. That's the one that says, that's like the top line that says where it's going to and what to do with it. Which of the following describes Baudot code? 7-bit, a code using error detection and correction, 5-bit code with start and stop bits, or a code using cell cal and listen?
C.
Baudot is a 5-bit code. What is indicated on a waterfall display by one or more vertical lines adjacent to a PSK signal? Long path, backscatter, insufficient modulation, or overmodulation? You got a signal, you got stuff on the outside of the signal, on either side of it. What's that mean?
D.
Sure. You just want the two tracks and the railroad tracks, you want the two tracks and the ties. Anything outside of that's excess, that's splatter. That's overmodulation.
I guess the question seems a little confusing. Two vertical lines.
Mhm.
Sounds like it's the ladder without the rungs. I guess.
Yeah, well, yeah, remember the vertical line, the waterfall display itself is the railroad track or the ladder. Okay, so a display is the ladder. Now you've got lines next to the ladder. Yeah, I agree with what you're saying. Yeah, what it's saying is there's other stuff outside the ladder. You don't have a pure display. You got a fat display, for example. That's overmodulation. What's meant by the term software-defined radio? One in which the most major signal processing and functions are performed by software. A radio which provides computer interface for automatic logging in band and frequency. A radio which uses crystal filters designed using software. Or a computer model which can simulate performance of a radio to aid in the design process. A radio which uses major signal processing functions are performed by software. All those other things are real things, but they're not software-defined radios. A computer model which can simulate performance of radios are essentially software, a radio-designed software is what it is. Those are all real things, but the one that we're talking about for software-defined radio is which major functions in radio are performed by software, not hardware. What's the relationship between transmit, symbol rate, and bandwidth? Symbol rate and bandwidth are not related. Higher symbol rate requires higher bandwidth. Lower symbol rate requires higher bandwidth. Bandwidth is constant for data mode signals. B. Higher the signal rate, the higher the bandwidth. You're correct. Discussion? Guess what? It's lunchtime.